and again the rebirth took place. The one who died in his former world was reborn in another material plane, becoming a librarian. It was a world of great people, achievements, and creatures, where the era of unrivaled warriors reigned, and where one returnee became a simply terrifying teacher. While some were awakening their talents and becoming masters of their destinies, the returnee wasted his time on all sorts of nonsense. For this very reason, no one took the returnee seriously. They teased him in every possible way, daring him to make mistakes. But the strict teacher kept watch over the returnee, and even more so when the simpleton began to ask the sister of a not very unimportant person to become his student. But one day, the returnee crossed the line of patience. The returnee decided that it was time for him to rise up, and there was simply no better place to achieve this than the library. From that very moment, the returnee's path to success began. But first, he met with his students, with whom he was not particularly gentle. The teacher mentally processed each of them. None of the students could even imagine how the teacher could find out about each one's sacred secrets. The charisma that the returnee possessed allowed him to capture the hearts and minds of others. Under such pressure, all the students fell to their knees. One by one, they swore an oath of allegiance to the returnee. But not everyone took the teacher's success calmly. Some believed that he was turning his students against others. Others considered the returnee's actions an insult to the martial arts master himself. But for the teacher, such attacks were just a trifle. No matter how much and how many times they tried to get rid of him, the teacher only became stronger. Day by day, his strength grew, and with it, the number of defeated enemies grew. Breaking through all obstacles, the returnee strove to reach the most sacred, the stars themselves. But these were just events that would unfold much later. Having been reborn in another world, the returnee immediately began to earn himself a bad reputation. Licking his lips and threatening with a knife, he drove the girl against the wall. Bringing the blade closer and closer to her throat, he wanted to make sure that the girl really wanted this. The girl doubted the returnee, especially since he was a truly good teacher. The returnee did not give up and insisted on the opposite. Besides, at the moment, no one even really knew him. For the sake of the beauty by the wall, the returnee introduced himself as Juan. After his self-introduction, Juan was immediately slapped. Having properly taught Juan a lesson, the girl went home in an angry state. Rubbing his cheek, Juan couldn't imagine that recruiting disciples could actually be such a difficult task. And in reality, Juan was far from the best teacher. No matter how much time passed, no one ever showed up to that lecture. Juan was so insignificant that the students even pitied him. But no one ever managed to become his student. The situation was hopeless until one day, a gentle female voice addressed Juan. A girl looked inside the classroom. Worried, she wanted to know if she had the wrong address. As soon as he heard her voice, Juan was already rubbing his hands, believing that luck had finally smiled on him. Then he deliberately coughed, asking in a stern voice whether the girl wanted to become his student. Beaming with happiness, the girl confirmed Juan's hope. Playing the role, Juan began to admonish the girl about the importance of choosing a teacher. In particular, Juan emphasized the intuition that should have pointed out correctly. The girl was confused, because in fact, she herself did not know which teacher she wanted to go to serve. Then, Juan began to ask the girl to demonstrate her skills, after which the returnee was ready to give valuable advice. First bowing, the girl then clenched her fists. Immediately the girl, whose name was Lita, began to demonstrate her fighting skills. But she did this, to tell the truth, quite far from Juan. In any case, while Lita was busy demonstrating, Juan was about to change his approach to the student. He waited until the girl finished her demonstration. Afterwards, Lita heard encouraging words from Juan regarding general technique. His flattery even touched upon the girl's special talent. In particular, Juan noted Lita's footwork. The girl was slightly embarrassed by Juan's words, because she had a mutilation in one of her legs, which meant that in reality, she could not be so good. Juan coughed, admitting that he simply hadn't noticed the girl's flaw right away. Then, changing his words to some advantage of Lita. Then shouting the word hope with all his might, Juan slapped himself on the thigh. Lita's eyes lit up with inspiration. However, Juan noted that only a couple of people, including him, could unlock Lita's potential. Next, Juan began to build up his value as a valuable specialist. Immediately, there was a crash behind him. Then Lita fell on her knees and began to beg Juan to take her as his student. Juan grinned wickedly and reached into his bosom. Taking out a knife and holding Lita's palm, Juan wanted to get consent to conclude the contract. The girl didn't even have time to answer before Juan cut her finger. Immediately, drops of her blood fell on the emerald stone in Juan's hands. Everything was done, and Juan had his own student for the first time. After a short conversation, Juan threw Lita out of the school walls, asking her to come tomorrow. Exhaling from success, Juan was glad that now he himself would not be kicked out, considering that from now on the matter remained small. But his joy did not last very long. an unknown force began to drag Juan away. Before he could even come to his senses, he found himself in some unknown space. What followed was an extremely long fall into the void, at the end of which, Juan was blinded by a glow. It is unknown how long it took, but Juan woke up. His eyes caught bizarre images of an unknown place. Finally, observing before oneself a great monolithic structure, Juan even thought that he had found himself at the gates of the Library of Heavenly Path. Juan couldn't understand a damn thing, because he didn't die to end up here again. In any case, pushing the gate in front of him, Juan went inside, because he had no other choice. His loud footsteps echoed through the halls filled with floating bookcases. Looking around, Juan couldn't understand how such a place could help him. However, the desire for the unknown prevailed. He hoped that among the stacks of books there would be at least one on combat. Reaching out for the books, Juan found that it had passed through the shelf. Later, he burst into a scream about how everything in this place was fake. A minute later, Juan woke up in his own world. The teacher had no idea what all this could mean. Just as he was about to leave the solution to these mysteries for later, someone called out to Juan. Cheerfully, another teacher boasted to Juan about his students. Juan didn't see any reason for joy in what was said, although in fact, he understood that he had only been dragged through the mud. Another teacher continued to belittle Juan, telling him how he had no students the entire previous semester. The students' laughter was immediately heard. Suddenly, Juan stopped this chatter. Another teacher couldn't understand why Juan took the lack of respect so lightly. Juan just grinned, because unlike the red-haired Chow, at least he was known. Moreover, right now, Lita stood up to defend Juan. The girl believed in Juan, and in his ability to make legends out of his students. Her words were stopped by the speech of the servant, who reminded Lita that she was wanted as a student of another. Hearing this, Chow mocked Huang. Having brought the girl to him, the servant began to explain that Lita would not become a student. Holding on, Juan began to seduce the girl again with the prospect of becoming a novice of an outstanding teacher. Along the way, he began to explain to the servant that students who renounced their teachers had a bad reputation. Moreover, Juan assured that he would reveal Lita's potential. Huang's sweet words were interrupted by Chow's protest. Cao intended to lure Lita to his side, and even arrange a duel with Huang in order to prove his right. Juan began to think, because in fact, Chow was a much more capable fighter, and a teacher too. Not wanting to lose his only student, Juan agreed to the fight. Subsequently, the scene changed to a fenced yard. Students were called from all over the area to watch the duel between the two teachers. Although many already had an idea that the battle would be unequal. Once out on the training field, Cao explained the rules, in which even the students took part. At first, there was a demonstration by the students, and Lita started it. Having prepared herself, she raised her fist. Next, with all his might, he directed it into a special area of the stone. The magic system immediately calculated the power points of that one. Cao spoke well of the girl, although he thought she had a leg injury. Silently, Juan admitted that in just one go, his opponent had recognized Lita's flaw. So Cao really was better. The situation was complicated, especially since Cao was already whispering something in Lita's ear. What was happening infuriated Juan, especially since he had not heard anything from their conversation. After the whisper, Cao asked the girl to repeat the exercise. Following his instructions, Lita took a special support. From now on, standing firmly, she began to accumulate strength. Afterwards, with his whole body, he directed the accumulated power into the stone. As soon as the strike was executed, the counter on the stone increased. The other students were delighted, because in just one exercise, Lita increased her strength by 10 points. Having finished, Cao now handed over his student to Huang, so that he could give his wise advice. But then, Juan suddenly ordered to stop. He reasoned out loud that the situation was unfair. Juan reminded that if he lost, he would lose Lita, but if he won, he would gain nothing. The situation that was voiced left Cao at a loss. After a short thought, Cao was ready to give Huang his student if he won. But Juan considered even such a proposal to be small. In fact, Juan was simply terrified of being disgraced. It was obvious that he would never have recognized the style of Chao's disciple. And the student himself was not eager to become a disciple of some non-entity. Juan looked closely at Chao's student, trying to identify any flaws in his technique. It was then that the unexpected happened. Juan blinked and was transported back to another dimension. However, he had no idea what caused these movements. For those who were already right now, being given hints in the air by an unknown force about a certain lack of spiritual strength. Then a book fell from one of the shelves. Floating in the air, she landed right in Juan's hands. It was the first physically tangible thing in this place. Opening the book, Juan discovered in it the entire story of Chao's student's family and his life. Additionally, the student's fighting style was described in great detail. When Huang read all this, it was at this moment that Chao's disciple carried out his attack. Subsequently, the stone scoreboard showed a figure slightly lower than Lita's results. Chao urgently requested that Huang, as a teacher, give his recommendations. Taking a closer look, Chao noticed that Huang was collected and, what's more, was laughing. Besides, Huang was now ready to demonstrate his strength. Therefore, Huang began with a numerical list of Chao's students' shortcomings. Naturally, Chao made fun of Huang's professional conclusion, and the other students picked up on it. The ridicule was wearing on Huang, and since no one wanted to take his words seriously, the returnee had no intention of competing. Then he leaves and calls Lita with him. Chao immediately blocked his way, apologizing for the mockery and wanting to continue the competition. Huang stopped, knowing that he would be able to surprise Chao quite a bit. Then Huang made a sharp movement with his hand. Loudly, he demanded that Chao's disciple change his striking hand. The student himself was not particularly sure that he should have done this, but Chao insisted on listening to Huang. So, with all his strength, the student now swung his left hand. Having gathered enough strength, he struck the stone. When the results appeared on the scoreboard, Teacher Cao's jaw almost dropped. All the observers also froze in shock. After all, the number on the scoreboard was truly astonishing. The student himself was taken aback when he looked at the scoreboard. Huang smiled because everything worked out as predicted. From now on, waiting for comments from Teacher Cao. After hesitating, Chao suddenly reached into his inner clothing pocket. Next, he deliberately bit the tip of his finger. After which, he smeared his precious stone with blood. The deed was done and Cao's student was now a former one. After which Chao left, calling his other students. As he left, he silently promised himself that he would find a way to take revenge on Huan. The bet was won, and Huan threw his stone to the new student so that he would sign the contract. There was no choice, so the student shed his blood. A little later, the scene changed to another part of the educational institution. It was a quiet place where students could spend their leisure time. Now, among themselves, they were actively discussing the news about Huan. Although Huan was known as a failure, he still managed to increase the strength of the student he entrusted to him by as much as 100%. News of this spread throughout the entire educational institution very quickly. Some of those who heard this thought that Huan was simply lucky. Some female students were actively arguing about this situation. From now on, one of them considered it her honor to teach Huan a lesson for what he had done. Very soon, she arrived at Huan's school. Seeing a man in front of her in a very strange state, she decided to check if he was Teacher Huang. Coming to his senses instantly, Huan confirmed what had been said. The girl brazenly demanded that Huan give her advice on how to increase her strength. However, Huan waved it off. He explained that he was recruiting students and not satisfying the demands of impudent girls. The girl was irritated by Huan's arrogance, and yet she was ready to listen to his conditions. Naturally, Huan wanted to see her as his student. The girl agreed, but in her mind she was already hatching a plan about how she would later become Cao's student. The girl's friends secretly watched this humiliating decision. Afterwards, he hurried to tell his family everything. At the same time, Huan was already changing his mind, because the girl had an unbearable temperament. In her soul, she was burning with rage at Huan's arrogance, but out loud she begged him to leave the student. After a couple of attempts at persuasion, Huan finally relented. Next, Huan immediately gave the girl her first task as his student to clean the classroom. This condition caused her to gnash her teeth and become dissatisfied. Huan sighed and sent her away. In response, the girl immediately grabbed the broom. While cleaning, she was already hatching a plan in her head about how she would definitely take revenge on Huan in the future. An hour later, Huan's entire auditorium was sparkling clean. Huan then handed the stone to the girl to sign the contract. She willingly agreed to sign the contract, actively playing the role and concealing her true intentions. Afterwards, Huan said that he had to make sure of the new student's strength, so the action moved back to the training field. Watching her movements, Huan emphasized that the new student's tactics were quite aggressive. Immediately, he went to the library dimension. After searching a little, he found a book dedicated to the new student. Opening the book, Huan was confronted not only with information that the girl was of noble birth, but also with the problems of her technique. He sighed, convinced that she had absolutely no special features. As he turned the pages of the book, at some point Huan became confused. Besides, right then the new student was carrying out her blow to the stone. The board lit up and a fairly large power figure appeared there. Huan applauded the girl, admiring her strength. Next, the girl began to wait for the master's advice, especially regarding mistakes. At the same time, she herself tightly clutched the crystal in her hand behind her back. The girl frowned, expecting to see how sweetly Huan would be disgraced when the verdict was delivered. But then the teacher came up close to her, loudly declaring that the girl's shortcomings were hidden in her illnesses. Naturally, she began to deny such shortcomings. Huan stood his ground and didn't even judge her. The girl hissed and didn't want to hear anything about any illnesses. In this case, Juan began to elaborate, naming specific places in which the girl felt a particular intensity of emotions at a specific time. Moreover, he knew how irritable the girl was most of the time. Juan's words hit the nail on the head, thoroughly embarrassing the girl. Juan attributed his awareness to his unprecedented experience. Since the truth was revealed, the girl naturally wanted to know about the method of healing. Juan was ready to help, but for this, the girl would have to come to tomorrow's training. Besides, Juan didn't insist if the girl still didn't trust him. Otherwise, Juan asked the girl to get rid of the recording crystal. The secret was revealed, and the student split the crystal in her palm. The girl was confused, because in just one attempt, Juan revealed all of her secrets. She didn't understand how, with his abilities, Juan could end up at the very bottom of the teacher rankings. At this moment, someone new has burst onto the scene. Like the wind, he swept between people. It was Yao himself, the city's administrator, who ordered everyone to stop. As it turned out, the girl was his younger sister. To Yao's horror, his sister confessed that she had become Huang's disciple. Yao was not going to let this go unanswered, and began to threaten Huang if he did not release the girl. The girl stopped Yao, because she became Huang's student voluntarily. Yao did not understand this decision, because Huang was the most unsuccessful of all the teachers. The girl was a little shy to reveal the truth about her decision. Every time she tried to confess, she stumbled. As she was trying, Yao noticed a recording crystal crushed on the ground. Yao was overcome with anger. He was already imagining how Huang had done something against the girl, this time threatening Juan with death if he did not let the newly minted student go. Unexpectedly, the girl herself stood up for Juan, threatening Yao to never communicate with him again. The manager was stunned by her words. Afterwards, she began to pull Yao along with her, because she needed to prepare for the next day of school. And yet, his furious gaze kept falling on Juan. Juan did not understand this attitude, because he had simply accepted a student. A little later, two students were walking near Juan's school grounds. They laughed, actively discussing their studies among themselves. At some point, one of them noticed something unusual. There was a first-class sign on the gate. One friend began to drag another inside the school, believing that a wise teacher might be teaching there. Inside, of course, they met Juan. Suddenly, one friend began to recruit another to become Juana's disciple. Juan was not averse to recruiting more people, but first he wanted to look at their skills. Not seeing Juan's grin, the boys headed to the training ground. The one who was forced to be Juan's disciple was not too willing to give it his all. Moreover, any student could refuse to sign the contract. With these thoughts in mind, he began to demonstrate his capabilities. He was very skilled in swinging his spear and thrusting. At the very end, striking the stone. Having demonstrated his strength, he began to wait for advice. Only after a couple of seconds of waiting did he realize that Juan hadn't been watching at all. The spear wielder sighed, as the rumors about Juan were confirmed. But then, a lover of looking into books spoke up. Juan's words confused the spearman, because he learned about the boy's affair with one of his students. This news was new to his friend. Moreover, Juan attributed the force of the spearman's blow to the emotions that possessed the boy. Juan called this same emotion the main problem of a spearman. The owner of the spear had no words to explain such knowledge to a stranger. In the end, Juan delivered a verdict on the uncertainty that plagued the spearman. Finally, the boys were convinced of the abilities that Juan had. Afterwards, approaching, she gave advice to the owner of the spear. Juan considered the most important thing to be the release of past grievances. At the end of his words, he even added a verse. His words, and especially the poem, greatly inspired the boy. Having given an analysis of the emotions, Juan demanded that the spearman carry out the attack again. The boy raised his spear, gathering strength. At this time, actively repeat to yourself the lines from the poem. A second later, he lunged. With redoubled zeal, damage was inflicted on the stone. Subsequently, the scoreboard showed a figure much higher than the previous one. His friend was indescribably delighted with his increased strength. Kneeling down and calling himself Zheng, the spearman begged to be taken as a disciple. His friend himself was not averse to becoming Juan's apprentice, but he found it strange that he had never heard anything about it. Juan introduced himself to the boys, and they instantly recognized the worst teacher in the entire school. Juan readily confirmed their words. Hearing this, their faces twisted in shock. Zheng couldn't understand why the teacher was so self-critical. Juan laughed it off, but in reality he remembered that only the Library of Heavenly Path had saved him. Afterwards, he said that he would be glad to see Zheng as his faithful follower. Consent was obtained, and a couple of minutes later the young people left Juan. Left alone, Juan was glad that in a short time he had already acquired a ton of students. And the registration stone was exhausted, so Juan went to get a new one. His path led to the educational institution's logistics building. When he got there, he didn't find a single registration stone on the counter. Moreover, there was not a soul inside. Suddenly, a big guy appeared behind Juan. It was Mook, the head of logistics. Juan remembered him very well, and also how the big guy always actively picked on the loser. Trying not to cause any problems, Juan explained that he had only come to get a new registration stone. Juan's words sent everyone into fits of laughter. Juan was not at all embarrassed and even offered to argue. Mook was not against the deal, but he knew that Juan had nothing to his name. Suddenly, Juan would put his own face on the line, and the winner would give the loser 3 slaps. Mook readily agreed. Juan also agreed to Mook's slightly updated conditions, since in the event of a loss, the returnee would receive slaps from everyone. Immediately after this, the registration book was thrown onto the table. Mook knew that through this, it was easy to determine whether Juan was lying about having students. Not long after, in uncertain voices, those accompanying Mook announced that Juan really did have students. Mook became angry and asked again furiously. Then he took the notebook and began to personally double-check the information. Mook expected that Juan would definitely take on a student with a leg injury. Gradually, the expression on his face became more and more frightening. Somehow, Juan managed to take even a couple of the best students as his disciples. He then proceeded to accuse Juan of having fooled the poor children. Juan didn't care about such words. He was more concerned with fulfilling the terms of the bet. Mook swallowed nervously and asked again. Quickly pulling himself together, he stated that he might not fulfill the previously announced conditions. Juan shook his head and said he had expected something like this. Mook's followers did not want to be beaten and, what's more, were not averse to giving Juan himself a good beating. Now, at Mook's direction, one of them was already taking aim at Juan. Mook didn't even watch the process because he knew that Juan couldn't handle fighters of higher rank than himself. A moment later, there was an unusual pop. Blood splashed onto the floor. The followers began to push Mook away because it was not Juan's blood. As it turned out, Juan managed to knock out one of Mook's followers. Mook was alarmed because something like this was simply impossible. Besides, Juan himself had forgotten the others. Pushing the other followers, Mook ordered them to deal with the impudent Juan. At that very moment, Juan closed his eyes. He was already transferred to the dimension of the Heavenly Library in a controlled manner. There he found the necessary lines concerning the weaknesses of his enemies. After which, he moved towards them in response. Maneuvering like a bee, he delivered painful jabs. By diving, he avoided attacks on himself. With light movements, he struck the most vulnerable places. At the end, moving towards the carcass of Mook. At speed, piercing him with 2 outstretched fingers. When Juan finished, his attackers could barely stand on their feet. When he shook off his hands, they fell to the floor. The victory was achieved thanks to the information Juan received about the vital points of his enemies. By influencing them, Juan could easily defeat a fighter 1,000 times stronger. Among all those who had fallen earlier, Mook was the first to rise to his feet. Juan didn't understand the big guy, who for some reason complicated an already difficult situation. Mook had no intention of engaging in dialogue, but instead began threatening Juan with an official complaint for assault. Mook's words were fully supported by his followers. Juan was unpleasantly surprised because he did not expect such meanness, and therefore, he was ready to share Mook's methods. Afterwards, he began to tell how, in order to please one lady, Mook stole the treasure. Another drove a student to suicide. Mook's third follower was actually a murderer, thereby taking over his brother's business. Everyone's mouths dropped because this information was top secret. Now that the truth has come to light, the bullies have begun to beg Juan for forgiveness. Juan was ready to remain silent, but only if his offenders learned their lessons. Mook promised not to behave like that again, and what's more, on his knees, he presented Juan with new registration stones. Later, they waved joyfully as Juan left. Juan himself was inspired, because finally his life was taking the right course. His thoughts were interrupted by the screams that could be heard nearby. A certain fat man in a rage threatened to commit suicide, but alone, he had no intention of dying. He actively grabbed the arms and legs of those who tried to dissuade him from committing suicide, after which he stubbornly dragged them along with him. Juan could hardly contain his laughter, because wherever he looked, the school was in disarray. Deciding not to interfere, Juan went in search of new students. Juan hadn't gone very far before something grabbed his leg. The fat man hung on stubbornly. The supposed suicide was distracted by what allowed the other students to escape. The fat man held Juan's leg tightly, pitifully asking to be taken as a student. Juan took pity, but still wanted to see his abilities. Having moved to another place, the fat man poured bricks out of the wheelbarrow. After which, asking Juan to be attentive, he took the couple into his hands. Next, he began to break bricks on his head. He crushed bricks against his hands. His steel shoulders turned the building material into dust. Even my legs didn't flinch when the bricks broke against them. Juan was confused because he did not understand the meaning. Suddenly, Juan's vision went out. He found himself in the library again. where an unknown force presented him with a book about the pros and cons of being a fat man. His pedigree was rich, but the fat man himself was far from being very capable. At some point in the text, Juan came across words about the power of the imperial blood. It just so happened that in the world where Juan found himself, lineage decided a lot. Blood, passed down from ancestors, was the main driving force in human development. The abilities during this transition were either inherited or modified. It just so happened that the fat man had the best of these bloodlines. Therefore, Juan was simply obliged to take the fat man in, naturally, handing over the stone to him to conclude the contract. Filled with joy, the fat man willingly sprinkled the stone with his blood. Then he became like a child and rejoiced that he finally had a teacher. Their conversation was interrupted as two people appeared on the scene. There were two teachers, and one of them was the best in the entire educational institution. The teacher named Shang, like all the previous ones, immediately belittled Juan. He even specified that he was insulting Juan specifically. Juan chuckled, pretending that Shang's words had no weight. He, of course, became furious, because he could not stand being considered a nobody. Even the beautiful teacher Mila, standing nearby, laughed at the way Juan portrayed Shan. So, Shan decided to take it out on the fat man who was standing nearby. Then he began to mock the fact that the fat man went to be a student of the most untalented teacher. Naturally, the fat man was amazed, because he knew nothing about it. At some point, Huang interrupted Shang's chatter, suggesting that he go about his boring business. The way Juan acted so provocatively naturally irritated Shan. Putting his arm around the teacher Mila's back, he suggested that she quickly get away from the vile Juan. But the beauty, on the contrary, became interested in it. She sincerely asked Juan not to give up and to continue to grow. Next, Mila asked Shan not to follow her anymore, because the teacher wanted to rest. Shang was insulted again, and therefore threatened Huang that he would definitely take revenge on him. While the conversation between the teachers was going on, the fat man tried to slip away. Juan noticed the escape attempt in time and stopped it. Suddenly, Juan grabbed the fat man's arm harshly. He had no intention of letting him go, because the blood contract had already been signed. Afterwards, despite all the persuasion from the fat man, he took him to his school. Some time passed since then, and Juan finally returned to his building. Juan glanced at the registration stone, thinking that he hadn't managed to recruit all that many students. Then he turned his gaze to the textbook lying nearby. He had to get ready because classes would start the next day. Moreover, Juan was the only one of the teachers who was still at the third rank of cultivation. So, after a little meditation, he headed to a certain place. He hoped to find a method to increase the success of his training. But Juan wanted to achieve results immediately, because there was simply no time for long-term development. Moreover, the snag in the development of rank was in Juan himself. He had thousands of faults, yet he stepped forward to seek advice from Elder Mo. Mo was a keeper and wanted to know what had brought Juan here at such a late hour. Juan honestly said that he wanted to cross the third rank. The old man saw no problem with Juan's slow development. However, Old Man Mo advised Juan where to try to find the necessary knowledge. The old man liked Juan and hoped that everything would work out for the young teacher. Entering the building, Juan came across a huge library. Everywhere there were huge shelves filled with piles of all kinds of books. Juan stopped at one of the passages, feeling that what he needed was somewhere there. Having passed, he began to sort through the books. Among the scriptures, he tried to find something about the work of teaching techniques. Juan didn't even notice how he was momentarily transported to the plane of the astral library. As he read, he believed that it was simply impossible to correct his own shortcomings. But then Juan realized that there was no need to correct anything at all. He realized that all it took was some adjustments to overcome the current stage of development. Filled with confidence, Juan began to read carefully. And then, finding useful references for yourself in the texts. First, Juan had to gather information about future ranks. Having collected the necessary books, he began to study them greedily. Hours passed and the stacks of books around him grew. At some point, it began to seem as if Juan had truly studied all the materials. From inside the building, the rustling and crunching sounds of pages being turned could be heard, something that even Old Man Mo noticed. A little later, Juan put all the previously taken books back in their places. Having found the necessary information, Juan left the building, now intending to resume practice as soon as possible. Seeing that Huang was already leaving, Old Man Mo even offered to take one of the books with him. Juan didn't need anything like that, so he said goodbye to the old man. The old man did not appreciate Juan's behavior and decided to report it to the dean. Later that evening, Juan was sitting at his desk, spreading out a pile of papers. Just as he was thinking about how to do everything, a random movement occurred. Without asking, an unknown force summoned him to the library. A moment later, books began flying off the shelves en masse. Juan recognized those because they were the ones he had studied in Mo's repository. But the books weren't just flying through the air, something was pulling them to a certain point in space. At a certain point, all previously hovering books were absorbed by this point. There was an explosion, followed by a bright flash. When the glow died down, an unusual book came into the light. Slowly, she began to sink into Juan's arms. Opening the book, Juan immediately realized that it was a collection of his own notes, but the information there was structured and, what's more, unique. Juan slammed the book shut and decided it needed a title, after which he looked around the astral library. In the end, I decided to call the new work The Technique of the Heavenly Path. As soon as he spoke, the title immediately appeared on the book, after which Juan closed his eyes. He assumed a special pose, feeling the new experience filling him. A spiritual ball gradually took shape in his palm. At some point, having reached its limits, the ball burst. The Rubicon of Juan's development had been crossed. Opening his eyes, he felt a breakthrough. Juan couldn't believe it, because in just one night, he had reached the whole 5th rank. His powers actually increased by thousands of % compared to their previous levels. Clenching his fists, Juan was sure that he owed his success to the astral library. Inspired, he hoped that the astral library would reveal other, deeper secrets of development to him. But in particular, Juan strove to attain the highest level of development of the soul energy, the divine. In any case, even the current results made Juan happy. By then, Juan was planning to evaluate his new powers. After leaving his house, he went to the training field. Next, I carry out my first swing after meditation. Gathering his strength, he launched a wave of fire at the stone. Juan's flaming palm melted and penetrated deep into the appraisal stone. After which, the scoreboard showed a previously unseen figure of 1,000. Juan doubted this assessment, because in terms of strength, he was equal to the wisest. With a degree of apprehension, Juan began to examine himself. Just in case, he decided to keep his achievements a secret for now. Just then, he heard a strange rustling sound not far from him. It was late, so Juan decided to investigate the source of the sound. Carefully, he began to move towards the rustle. Already at the building, he furtively peered around the corner, seeing there the figure of a man who was clearly sneaking up to Juan's dwelling. The man in the assassin's garb planned to teach Juan a cruel lesson for making his sister his apprentice. Juan prepared to act, but first he took off his uniform. He did it so loudly that the assassin looked back. Naturally, Juan was noticed immediately. Juan peeked out from around the corner and revealed that he had come to kill the failed teacher. Hearing this, the assassin stopped, but did not answer. A little later, the assassin decided to give Juan the right to kill, and he would take on the cover. For some reason, Juan decided to find out why the assassin left this matter to someone else. As it turned out, the assassin did not plan to eliminate Juan, but only to teach him a lesson. Then the assassin began to confess that he would castrate Juan, thereby humiliating him. Juan cringed at these details and was glad that he went to train instead of sleeping. So Juan let the assassin through first. Besides, I already warned that you need to be careful with the victim. After this was said, the assassin instantly changed his position. He caught up with Juan, feeling how strong the aura was from him. He asked his supposed brother in the craft to concentrate and be ready for anything. Meanwhile, thanks to the astral library, Juan was able to learn a lot about the assassin. As it turned out, he was a capable fighter, and even surpassed Juan himself in strength. But nothing could stop Juan from taking revenge on his future offender. Such ideas even caused him to burst into uncontrollable laughter. The assassin noticed that the other killer was behaving extremely strangely. It was at that moment, to distract attention, that Juan pointed to something. The assassin immediately began to peer into the darkness. The distraction worked, and Juan ran up to him. Running, he kicks the assassin in the ass. The assassin's mask flew off and a cry of pain was heard. The force of the blow itself pushed him into the wall. With a noise and dust, he crashed into her. As it turned out, Yao was hiding behind the assassin's mask. Juan looked at him with disdain. Having recovered, Yao himself could not understand what the hell had happened. Flexing his fists, Juan made it clear that he would not help him against himself. From the mad smile and evil intentions, a grimace of horror was reflected on Yao's face, after which a just punishment followed. All night long, screams and pleas could be heard in the surrounding area, accompanied by heavy blows. After some time, Juan finished the execution. In some ways, Juan even felt sorry for the poor guy, since he was beaten by someone one rank lower. However, Juan still had to divert suspicion from himself. A plan was born in Juan's head to blame everything on another teacher. After which, he spoke to the assassin again. Juan presented everything skillfully. Surely one of the teachers would have ordered Juan's death. This means that if he had been castrated, the suspicion would have been too high. So Juan ordered the assassin to get lost. The assassin quickly got up and ran away. Juan himself could finally open his face and breathe freely. Now, in order to survive, he needed doubly strong. Hours passed, a new day arrived, and Juan's training began. Juan explained what his teaching method was. Suddenly Juan turned to Lita. He started with her as his first student. Lita herself was in a depressed mood. After all, she revealed the truth about Juan as a deceiver. Standing in front of Juan, she was required to demonstrate her skills once again. The girl hesitated, thinking that there was little space around. But Juan demanded unquestioning obedience from Lita. Knowing everything about her, he put out his palm instead of an evaluation stone. The shot was taken and Juan assessed it as good. At the end of the demonstration, Lita wanted to say something. Juan interrupted her, starting to tell her about the girl's injury. Somehow he knew Lita had gotten it in battle. Juan even described in detail which specific point on Lita's leg was causing the pain. The girl held her breath, because even the best doctors didn't know about this. Naively, she hoped that the teacher would be able to heal her. Juan was not averse to it, calling the procedure trivial. Now, I'm preparing something for treatment. Finally, Juan demanded that Lita sit down and relax. Having taken her position, Lita was apprehensive about what lay ahead. Unexpectedly, Juan threw a pre-prepared needle. It whistled through the air and struck the girl in the thigh. Lita had no idea that such great powers were hidden within Juan. But the unsuccessful teacher himself did not stop, continuing to throw needles. One after another, they dug into Lita's leg. Then Juan used spiritual power. Lita closed her eyes, feeling warmth mixed with pain. The teacher's spiritual energy entered her body. At some point, the pain left Lita. Looking down, she saw Juan taking out the needles. The teacher smiled, which signified the end of the treatment, and Lita herself no longer felt any discomfort. In just one moment, her long illness left her. Falling to her knees, she began to loudly thank Juan. In response, the teacher only demanded that he train harder. A little later, Io expressed a desire to leave Juan. The fat man agreed to his proposal. But the fat man wanted to do everything carefully, without unnecessary noise. Io did not agree and wanted to act more boldly. Io justified his doubts by saying that no one even knew Juan's rank. After he said this, the door to the room opened slightly. Lita and the teacher stood on the threshold. Io stared at them blankly. The fat man noted that the girl did not look disappointed. Io frowned, thinking that Juan had told the girl something. Suddenly the doors opened even wider. A bandaged Yao appeared, leading Nika behind him. Juan naturally did not recognize the bandaged Yao. The girl asked the teacher again, not understanding. But then Yao spoke up, reminding him who he was. He then began to threaten that he would actively follow Juan. Juan asked Yao to be quiet, as he demanded silence in the classroom. Such insolence infuriated Yao. In order not to get his hands dirty, Juan asked Nika to sort things out. So the girl immediately began to drive her relative out, eventually pushing him out into the street. But even there, Yao continued to squeal with threats. Now Juan called to Io, for his turn had come. Io himself was not averse to seeing what the teacher had prepared. Walking into another room, Io heard that Juan had not expected him to demonstrate his fighting skills, although the teacher admitted that Io was quite capable. Besides, Juan somehow knew about Io's secret practices. Juan attributed his awareness to foresight. It was a revelation to Io that the teacher was capable of such a thing. Juan continued, noting the pains that Io experienced during practice. The student recoiled, for extremely intimate things were mentioned. Juan explained that Io's technique was high level, but the student himself could hardly master it, due to the lack of rank. Io didn't even know what to say to something like that. However, Juan insisted that Io stop his secret practices. After all, he risked seriously injuring his hand. After hearing this, the student knelt down in front of Juan. Just asking him to listen, Juan helped him to stand up. Io's eyes lit up. Now he considered Juan a true teacher. After a while, the door from the hall where all the action took place opened. The other disciples looked at Io expectantly. The fat man was the first to decide to find out his opinion. However, Io changed his previous decision radically. Now he idolized Juan, further shaming the doubting students. Later, the conversation turned to Nika. While talking to her, Juan noted the special characteristics of the girl's body. Trying to hide them with combat practices, Nika caused herself discomfort. Juan called the change in the principle of practice the way out of the situation. Then he promises to find a way to help Nika. The girl could not hope for more. After some time, Juan handed over a teaching aid to another student. The fat man cried, thanking Juan for such a present. Later, he even began to hug Juan. The fat man was strong, and therefore he squeezed the teacher almost to death. Next, it was Zheng's turn. A little while later, Juan spoke in front of the entire class, but his speech was rudely interrupted. First, someone knocked down the front doors. Then he started frantically calling Lita. The girl immediately realized that it was her brother. It was Tao, the legendary fighter who challenged Juan, but he gave the teacher a chance to save himself by disbanding the students. Juan was not frightened, only noting that Tao was disrupting the lesson. Tao smiled, because he learned a lot about Juan. Suddenly, Juan used spiritual energy of his rank. Tao was taken aback. although he knew that there was no reason to be afraid of Juan. Overcoming his fear, he began to draw his sword. Then, he suddenly launched an attack. In a split second, he rushed past Lita. Seeing the danger, Lita tried to warn the teacher. At that moment, time seemed to stand still for Juan. But the sword never reached its target. Tao's blade was stopped by just 2 fingers. Without giving in, Tao demanded that Huang release his sword. But there was no reaction from Juan at all. It seemed as if he had entered into some kind of trance. Tao growled in indignation, because Juan had always been a weakling. Desperately, he still tried to harm Juan. But time after time, nothing worked. Until in the end, Tao was not kicked out of class at all. Thus, Juan carried out his little revenge. Of course, Yao couldn't help but notice this noise. Opening the gate slightly, he decided to take a look. But then he was stunned by surprise. Tao flew straight into Yao. They knocked down the gates and then rolled down the street. Poor Yao was pressed against the wall again. At the same time, Juan was ready to continue his studies. The students were still reeling from the teacher's display of power. With just one push, Huang defeated Tao so easily. To everyone, this scene seemed simply impossible. For Lita, what happened was a mystery. Nika believed that Juan always hid his strength. Already on the street, Yao scolded Tao for his failure. Tao nervously joked. At one point, Tao voiced that he had applied the new technique incorrectly. Avoiding giving precise answers, he suggested that Yao simply wait. Yao agreed, but had one question for Tao. And then Yao started talking about teacher Mila. Tao began to talk about her and the admirers who surrounded the beauty. From this story, Yao became convinced that Huang had enemies on the side as well. Subsequently, the scene changed. The teachers there were actively discussing Juan. Juan's behavior in particular has caused a lot of controversy. At some point, a shaky alliance was formed against it. Shang called an ally with him to teach Huang a lesson. At some point, they arrived at the walls of Juan's school. To his surprise, he found Yao and Tao there. The meeting was quite unexpected. Then, Tao decided to explain his presence in this place. Shan was angry to learn that Huang had lied even to Lita. Additionally, Tao introduced Yao as another dissatisfied person. The more Shan learned, the more amazed he became. Now, calling on everyone to unite for retribution. At that very time, Juan was teaching a lesson. The students listened attentively to him. At some point, Juan noticed that they were looking at him very strangely. Once again, the school doors creaked and opened. 4 people united by the same hatred entered inside. Juan followed their movements with his gaze. The first to speak was Shang, who condemned Huang for cheating. Juan responded cheekily, not averse to discussing everything later. Then, seeing a cheeky smile from Shang gave Huang an excuse to save himself by disbanding the disciples. Juan laughed off the threat, as fighting between teachers was forbidden. Shang thought otherwise, because Juan was a terrible disturber of order. Changing tactics, Juan began to remind him that teacher Mila would not appreciate Shan's impulses. Shan laughed. It was impossible to catch him making love to you. After hearing what Shang said, Yao's eyes flashed with hatred. He believed that it was Shan who beat him up that night, after which he hit him with all his might. Shang recoiled, cursing vigorously at Yao. Yao himself barely restrained himself from the next blow, explaining that Shan himself was to blame for everything. At that moment, Shang tried to threaten Yao if he didn't stop, but this only forced Yao to attack him. Others did not understand the reasons for such aggression. Juan kept a sly silence, everything was going as he planned. Only a minute later, Yao was pulled away from Shan. Xiao, lifted from the floor, looked pitiful. The fight could have continued until Juan barked at everyone. He ordered all outsiders to leave the class immediately. Barely moving his lips, Shan muttered something in response. After which, out loud, he began to threaten everyone with consequences. In the evening, when classes ended, the students left the classroom. Taking Yao with her, Nika couldn't understand what came over him. Lita was the last to say goodbye to Juan, but she didn't have time to go very far. Suddenly, her arm was grabbed tightly. Roughly, Tao was about to take his sister home. He didn't accept any excuses from her. In another place, Xiao was now actively lamenting. After his beating, he believed that Yao was in league with Huang. Yao's actions only convinced Shang even more. And yet, just in case, I decided to ask again about Huan's previously voiced misdeeds. Cao did not go back on his words. Words like these were enough for Xiao to complete the application. At the same time, he asked that the proposed fine be raised to the maximum. Soon the scene changed to Lita's family mansion. The girl was forced to her knees and scolded. The head of the family was very unhappy with his daughter's choice. Lita defended Juan, speaking only well of him. But the head of the family didn't really believe these words. Even more so, stating that Juan could only grow trash like himself. Because of this whole situation, the head of the family was basically disappointed in his daughter. He was genuinely interested in Lita's knowledge of her teacher. The words of the head of the family were supported by other relatives and ordinary servants. citing Tao as an example. Lita couldn't agree with this, because Juan had cured her. Relatives considered such words to be complete nonsense. They began to ridicule Lita as a rather gullible girl. The longer this went on, the more nervousness appeared in Lita herself. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Lita screamed that she would not leave Teacher Juan. Her emotions discouraged those around her. But then a new laugh was heard. The head of the family even stated that Lita would no longer appear in Juan's class. Without answering, the girl began to leave the house. At some point, he stopped and turned to the column to measure the forces. To prove her point, Lita swung her sword sharply, after which she struck. Pulling back her fist, she was already raising her leg. Another hit that changed the numbers on the column by tens of units. Everyone was stunned by the demonstration that had been carried out. Pointing to the power figures, Lita claimed that Juan had helped her achieve this. Looking at all this, the head of the family had no words to comment on what had happened. Then he asked what Juan had talked about in his lectures. Lita felt embarrassed, as she remembered little due to the weight of the information. Still, the girl listed some words from Juan's study material. The value of what they heard amazed everyone. Finally, the head of the family changed his mind, demanding that Lita never leave Juan. Next, asking the teacher to put in a good word for the other fighters in the family. Other relatives were not very happy with this decision. The head of the family came to his senses and nodded. But then, other relatives began to ask Lita to speak for themselves in front of Juan. The head of the family was shocked by such treachery on the part of those, and Lita herself didn't really know what to answer to something like that. At the same time, Juan was on his way to the school library. There, once again turning to the venerable Mo. The old man did not expect to see Juan again. Suddenly, the old man refused to search for the materials Juan needed. Naturally, Juan decided to find out the reasons for this answer. Just then, light steps were heard behind him. Then the gentle voice of Mila was heard, whom old man Mo willingly led into the library. The beauty smiled and thanked Mo. It was now that Juan spoke up, outraged by this injustice. For the first time, Mila saw that Juan was not interested in that at all, but in books. So she decided to ask the old man for Juan. Mo sighed and decided to change his mind. However, he warned Juan not to dare disturb the order. Nodding in response, Juan also thanked Mila. Next, I decided to go to the library first. Mila was stunned again, because Juan ignored her again. Once inside the library, Juan thought to himself that he had not expected to encounter such difficulties. And he found the library itself, in general, not very large. Juan felt it was necessary to hurry so as not to come here again in the future. As quickly as possible, he looked around for the right shelf of books. At this moment, old man Mo sensed something was wrong. Moving heavily, he jumped off his perch. Somehow, Mo found out that Juan was planning to cause chaos in the library again. He then hobbled inside, where Juan was now actively studying the books. From inside the room, the rustling of paper could be heard loudly. The old man even became interested in what Juan had in mind. From the side, Mo kept an eye on what books Juan took. At some point, I noticed that he was holding a manual on planting grapes in his hands. The old man was taken aback by Juan's strange choice. Then I saw that Juan was taking almost everything in a row. Mo's suspicions were confirmed, because Juan was again engaging in all sorts of nonsense. Mila was now watching him with interest. She began to understand why Mo didn't want to let Juan in. On the other hand, the woman's heart told her that in this way, Juan wanted to attract Mila's attention. In order to stop the chaos in the library, Mila went to that. Coming closer, she sternly asked about Juan's occupation. Mila didn't believe that Juan was simply reading. The beauty didn't even notice how, during the exchange of a few words, Juan began to distance himself. At some point, having witnessed the following, Juan hurried along the shelves, tearing books off along the way and reading them. Seeing his behavior, Mila decided to point out that in this way, Juan would not attract her. Juan then turned around and asked irritably if everything was okay with his sweetheart, rudely demanding that Mila leave him alone. The girl was confused, having encountered such rudeness towards her for the first time. And yet, he decided to find out which of the two would be the first to give up. Thus long hours passed and evening came. No matter how long Mila waited, Juan still didn't pay any attention to her. It was then that Juan, exhaling, slammed shut another book. All the books on the topic were studied and transferred to the astral library. He accidentally noticed that Mila was still in the room, but Juan didn't care about her, so he headed for the exit. There, being stopped by the long cane of old man Mo. Mo made it clear that Juan was no longer a welcome guest in the library. Naturally, Juan asked about the reasons. The old man was angry because he thought that Juan was fooling around and not reading books, only leafing through them in vain. But since Juan really no longer needed to return, he took the ban calmly. Suddenly, someone called out to Juan. It was Mila, who was also leaving the library. Suddenly, the beauty asked Juan to remember something from what he had read. Juan turned and asked for more details. After some thought, Mila asked Juan to remember something from the book on medicines. The beauty believed that she had put Juan in an extremely awkward position. Sighing, Juan was ready to retell what he had read, but asked for clarification. Then, through her inner discontent, Mila asked Juan to explain a certain line. What she said, Juan unexpectedly called a mistake. Then he began to explain everything in detail. Mila was speechless, because Juan actually knew the lines from the book. But then Old Man Mo intervened, asking Mila not to rush to conclusions. Mo also decided to test Juan by asking him about the words in the next book. This question offended Juan. Then he began to clearly explain the principles of the journey of spiritual energy. The old man was stunned because even he, a sage, did not know such a thing. Therefore, in order to double-check everything, Mo rushed to his library as quickly as possible. There he found the necessary stack of books. I picked up a suitable volume. Opening the book, Mo's eyes almost popped out of his head. It turned out that Juan had managed to study even the most difficult book of all. Meanwhile, Juan announced that he did not want to wait for anyone and left. As a result, the old man was left alone and in an extremely weakened state of mind. Mo didn't believe that with such abilities, Juan was the worst of the teachers. At the same time on the street, Mila caught up with Juan. Mila hinted that she hadn't eaten all day. Mila held her smile while Juan practically sent her away with his innuendos. Suddenly, she managed to attract Juan's attention with words about free food. Juan agreed to this proposal, warning in advance that he was insatiable. Again getting irritated, Mila agreed to this condition. Then their night march began. Juan followed Mila silently along the paved path. The beauty didn't like that her companion didn't say a word. At some point she turned around to ask him something. Immediately he saw that Juan was enveloped in a strange shimmering aura. In this image, Mila recognized special spiritual practices. Mila was speechless, because only the head of the educational institution himself could achieve such a level of development. The beauty began to believe that all this time, Juan had been deliberately underestimating his capabilities. In this way, Juan achieved rapid progression in his skills, and Juan himself has now come to his senses. In fact, he had no plans whatsoever to raise his rank. It all happened spontaneously, when Juan was just thinking about the beauty of the surrounding landscape. In any case, their path led them to a local tavern. Juan never expected that Mila would take him to such a luxurious establishment. They both went inside. Inside, amidst the mass of voices and the clatter of utensils, a strange knocking sound could be heard. It was Chao who laughed out loud at Huang's future fate. Next to him sat the beaten Shan, loudly threatening the teacher with some kind of heavenly beast. Chao agreed, claiming that the beast could be controlled if it was fed and watered on time. While they were talking, the waiter placed food on the table. The waiter bowed, asking to call him in case of new orders. Looking at the food, Shan turned to the waiter, asking him to feed his lion at the same time. The waiter readily agreed to fulfill this request. Chao became interested in the conversation, as well as in why Shang was treated with such respect in this place. In response, Shan began to tell a story about a tavern owner who failed to become the head of an educational institution. He further explained that Grandfather Xiao himself was also friends with the main tavern. As they were talking, Chao noticed something. Alarmed, he pointed to Juan and Mila, who were nearby. Shan was amazed, because he had never managed to drag a beauty into this establishment. Chao reassured Shan, because he had a plan on how exactly to disgrace Huang in the eyes of the woman. Shan glanced at him with interest. About 10 minutes later, chopsticks were loudly laid down at another table. In this way, Juan made it clear that he had eaten his fill. Mila was still upset, because Juan hadn't paid any attention to her the whole evening. The waiter arrived and asked Mila for a fairly large payment for everything. The beauty was perplexed, because the total price of what she ordered did not exceed 100 coins. The waiter laughed and pointed to the wine, which made up the bulk of the stated amount. Mila was in despair, explaining that the wine was presented, but it was not what they ordered. The waiter considered such excuses to be unchangeable. What he said made Mila's teeth grind. The woman admitted that she did not have enough money to pay right now. The waiter kept pressing her, demanding immediate payment rather than paying off the debt later. Just then, Sean appeared behind the waiter, asking what was going on. Sean made it clear that he was unhappy with the noise being made. The waiter, grinning sweetly, explained the whole point of the situation to Shan. Next, Shang turned to Huang, shaming him for failing to pay for his guest. Huan looked at him with confusion. In every way that seemed sophisticated to him, Shang continued to shame Huan. Shan chuckled to himself, because it was he who had orchestrated the whole situation. Shan was sure that this way he would divert all of Mila's attention from Huan. Right now, Mila jumped up from her seat. Shan beamed with sweet anticipation, believing that the right thing was about to happen. Later, seeing the anger in Mila's eyes, Shang tried to turn the fiery gaze away from himself and towards Huang. Right now, Juan explained that it was the teacher Mila who treated him. Sean was confused, because all his guesses turned out to be a failure. Now, faced with Mila's condemnation of his words, Chao secretly prompted Xiao to pay for everything himself. Hearing this, Shan instantly threw a thick wallet on the table. Sean hoped that at least in this way he would be able to please Mila. However, the beauty refused this gesture. After which, Mila tore off her precious pendant, handing it over as payment. Mila made it clear that she would buy it back over time. Shang found himself out of luck again and turned to Chao for advice. It was now that Juan decided to put in his word. Standing up, he said that the food was overpriced. Juan was sure that the waiter was deliberately lying. This speech kindled a flame of indignation in the waiter. Shang and Chao laughed silently, thinking that Huang had just gotten himself into trouble. Juan's actions, even his words of defense, were not entirely clear to Mila. But Juan could no longer be stopped. Speaking of food, which in fact wasn't very good, Juan announced to everyone that the food was poorly prepared. Juan even described many of the dishes as store-bought, rather than specially grown at the inn. The waiter grinned, because Juan's words about the dishes were indeed true. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore and demanded solid evidence from Juan. Frowning, Juan asked him sternly, after which he grabbed the decanter of wine. Next, tilt the decanter and begin pouring the wine onto the floor. Juan wanted to demonstrate something about the true value of wine. Then with a maniacal smile he lit a match, and he deliberately threw it into the spilled wine. The fire broke out immediately. Following this, a terrible stench spread throughout the entire hall. Thus, Juan confirmed the truth of his words. His demonstration of deception caused a strong reaction among the visitors. The waiter found himself in an extremely unpleasant situation in which he could have lost everything. Shang and Chao looked at each other, not really understanding what had happened. And the waiter himself now understood whose fault it was that he found himself in such a difficult situation. He turned around in an instant and ordered Shang and Chao to go away. The waiter demanded that the two idiots never show up in the establishment again. While the argument was going on, Juan suggested that Mila leave the establishment. The beauty admired Juan, especially how he was able to resolve a difficult situation. Juan himself owed his performance to the Library of the Heavenly Path, where he learned everything about dishes. Later, on the street, Mila caught up with Juan. Juan automatically made it clear that gratitude was unnecessary. And yet, in gratitude, Mila invited Juan to dinner again sometime later. Juan began to wave it off, because he no longer needed such a thing. The beauty took Juan's refusals hard, literally putting pressure on her feminine pride. Moreover, Juan had already said goodbye. But just now, Shang and Chao appeared nearby. The beaten man rolled up his sleeves, threatening Juan with reprisals. He openly challenged Juan to a fight, demanding that he not hide behind a woman. Juan saw nothing wrong with this, especially since he was a supporter of equality. His words like a sharp hook pierced Shan's very heart. Then Juan left, leaving the two bullies in the care of Mila. In fact, Juan was not at all concerned with any words, because he was a returnee from another world. Still, Shang urged Juan to stop, after which, he began to call upon the beast at the top of his voice. Almost immediately, the image of a lion appeared from the darkness of the streets. Finally, a threatening roar was heard. The terrible beast approached Shang, who called on him to destroy Huang. As a reward, he even promised to give the beast one special pill. Additionally, he held Mila, who wanted to stop all this. Shang had already come up with a story in advance about the lion protecting its owner when Huang tried to kill him. And yet, for some reason, the lion was in no hurry to fulfill his master's will. Only after the command was received, an even more menacing roar was heard from the lion. After which, he ran towards Huan. Mila tried to loosen Shan's grip and save the failed teacher. But the lion moved much faster than Mila could even imagine. Worried about Huan's life and reproaching herself, Mila fell to her knees. At the same time, Shan noticed that the lion had stopped moving and became silent. He openly believed that Huan was finally finished. However, Cao was now radiating different emotions. It's scary, he was pointing at something. Shang did not believe that Huang had any chance of surviving the encounter with the lion. Until I finally took a closer look and was stunned. The beast leaned against Huan, receiving affection from him. Shan was ready to tear his hair out, absolutely not believing what was happening. He even decided to command the lion once again. Shan promised that for fulfilling the order, he would buy the lion anything. The squeals from the others irritated Huan, so he asked the lion to deal with it. The lion roared and turned around, after which he rushed back towards Shan. With one sweeping blow of his paw, he threw Shan off to the side. Of course, he crashed into the wall. As quickly as possible, Cao rushed to help Shan. Shang himself radiated despair, because the lion still served his grandfather. But for some reason, the beast had no sympathy for Shan himself. Just then, Mila arrived at Huan's side. Mila wanted to know how Juan had managed to pull off such a trick in the first place. After some thought, Juan said that the heavenly lion had turned out to be extremely accommodating. In another case, Juan called his unprecedented beauty, which the beast was attracted to. In any case, Juan said goodbye to everyone. As expected, Juan again pulled off the trick with the beast using the astral library. Mila continued to pursue Juan, not allowing him to reach the house in peace. Seeing this, Juan even prayed that Mila would stop pursuing him. Once again, Juan's words made the beauty lose her temper. Having apologized, Juan very tenderly asked to be left alone. The manners given made the beauty smile. Taking pity, she let Juan go until the next meeting. At least for this, Juan could thank her. Around the same time, in the tavern, the waiter was making excuses. But his words had little effect. The owner of the establishment noted that the waiter's deception would have been revealed sooner or later. And yet, he wanted to know the name of the person who had defamed the name of the establishment. The waiter told everything he knew about Juan. The name of a certain brat provoked a violent reaction from the owner of the establishment. A little later, in another place, Juan himself was thinking about how he could further develop. Obtaining new ranks was already a difficult task. Juan needed access to documents that were usually only available to elders. He was worried that the progression of his powers might be revealed, and then Juan would get into trouble. At the same time, he saw salvation, since fairs often came to the city. So, Juan decided to go there and confirm his reasoning. Thus, his path led him to the city's commercial district. Juan looked around, impressed by the place itself. He hoped that the astral library itself would be able to help him with the search. Approaching one of the merchants, Juan decided to take a look at the goods. The merchant himself actively campaigned for the purchase of his incredible goods. Now, looking at the bell, Juan mentally transported himself to the astral library. So, he learned that the bell even had its own value. Seeing how long Juan had been looking at the bell, the merchant even decided to lower the price. Although Juan appreciated the bell's usefulness, he concluded that its quality was low. So for now, he decided to find out about something else. Hearing the name of the product, the merchant began to boast that only he could have something similar. Next, presenting an open box of herbs for display, Juan was in no hurry to buy, wanting to examine everything first. Once again, thanks to the astral library, he was convinced of the quality of the product. But then I noticed that one of the plants had a dried out stem. Juan suspected that the merchant was keeping the plants in less than ideal conditions. The merchant waved it off, assuring that he knew his business. But in the end, even immediately agreeing to give this product away for half price. Again, through the astral library, Juan learned a lot about the plant. In particular, it was an important ingredient in strong medicines, so the returnee decided to make a purchase. Juan was already imagining to himself how quickly he would be able to solve various problems. A minute later, Juan's purchase was wrapped. But then something unexpected happened to Juan. He completely forgot to take money with him. The merchant noticed that for some reason the deal could not take place. Only after feeling a handful of coins in his pockets did Juan ask him to sell everything to him for a much cheaper price. Naturally, this proposal infuriated the merchant. Juan tried to convey that he was not trying to make fun of the merchant. Still, he hoped for a change in the merchant's verdict. The merchant was adamant. Juan refused to leave, still insisting on selling at a lower price, and even transferring it for free. These words completely shocked the merchant. He even asked if Juan himself believed what he was saying. Juan sighed and offered to hit himself. Out of curiosity, the merchant extended his hand to Juan. He instantly sensed Juan's rather low rank. It didn't come to blows because Juan somehow named the merchant's hometown. Additionally, knowing that the merchant had recently been bitten by a snake, and also naming the consequences that the trader faced after the bite, the merchant was confused because this secret was known to only 2 people in the whole world. Now Juan wanted to hear if his words were a lie. The merchant reacted when Juan hinted at a cure for the ailment. For just one treatment, the merchant was ready to part with all his goods. Then Juan began to talk about the effects of snake venom. The returnee said that the medicine was located in the snake itself. The merchant was amazed by such a simple style of solution. Excited, the merchant decided to try the method. After rummaging through his goods, he found a box containing a snake. Having quickly killed her, he began to cut her up. Next, he carefully removed the bile, after which, he absorbed it as quickly as possible. At that very second, he felt the effect. Falling to his knees, the merchant idolized Juan for his healing. Now, Juan expected to receive the goods for free. At the same time, people passing by were actively discussing someone. Their conversations concerned a certain master whose appearance was rare. Juan and the merchant also heard these conversations. The merchant explained that the master was a great appraiser, whom almost everyone sought to meet. Juan knew something about such people, and in particular, that their advice was not always accurate. And Juan himself did not need anything like that. because the astral library revealed everything to him. So now he was saying goodbye to the merchant. At the same time, a suffering crowd gathered in front of the master. The master greeted everyone, being ready to give advice to only 5 people. Meanwhile, Juan continued to wander around the market and evaluate the goods. Once again, I was convinced that the prices on the market were inflated. Meanwhile, people were saddened by the news that the master did not stay long. The master blamed everything on his busy schedule, finally being ready to begin his assessment. People were alarmed, even actively offering to pay the master for his services. The master interrupted the roar of the crowd, explaining that he was not looking for money. The master cites gratitude in return as the only reason for his help. Additionally, making it clear that he no longer wants to hear anything about money. The master also warned that there was always a chance of error when making an assessment. After all that was said, hands reached out, wanting to receive an assessment from the master. Then, walking through the market, the master stopped at one of the stalls. After looking for a couple of seconds, he offered the common people to buy an expensive vase. It came as a shock to many that an ordinary vase could be so precious. Juan looked at all this with condemnation, because the vase was of no use. Juan didn't know what to think, because in theory the master shouldn't have made a mistake. Right now, instantly, he found himself again inside the astral library. A book fell from one of the shelves and subsequently landed in Juan's hands. Opening the pages of the book, he learned a lot about the master. It so happened that, thanks to his charismatic skills, the master even fooled Juan. Naturally, since the master was a fraud, he also had victims. However, Juan did not need the appraiser's help. Oddly enough, the master chose him as the last one to give advice when he was leaving. Juan had no idea why the master had paid attention to him. The master insisted on advice, and the crowd put pressure on Juan. Juan tried his best to refuse. The master did not let Juan go, trying to force him to accept his help. Moreover, the master assured that he knew Juan's wishes. This kind of self-confidence and pestering from the master infuriated Juan. Using his charisma, the master tried in every possible way to pull the wool over Juan's eyes. Then he pointed to the cobblestone, without which Juan would not have been able to live normally. The cobblestone merchant readily quoted Juan an exorbitant price. At some point, Juan became furious, demanding that they stop fooling him. Everyone fell silent, because in a fit of rage, Juan declared the master a fraud, and the master's face changed too. At this point, Juan himself could not contain himself, and began to explain what exactly he was accusing the master of. The appraiser responded to these accusations with a shout. The master justified himself by citing his service record as evidence, and the crowd itself supported the master. Being a forgiving person, the master was ready to forgive Juan for an apology. However, Juan was not going to give up so quickly. The master pretended not to understand what Juan was getting at. Next, we started talking about Juan's suspicions. Some in the crowd began to insist that Juan confirm his accusations. The master readily supported this idea, after demanding that Juan choose any subject for evaluation. With help from the astral library, Juan readily agreed. Next, he tried to find support from the merchant, but he refused to help Juan in any way. The master intervened and took on the possible expenses in the event of Juan winning. Juan even thanked the master for such kindness. Next, choose a random stone from the counter. Having made sure that it was right, Juan threw the stone into the master's hands. Now, Juan asked the master to demonstrate the value of the stone to the crowd. What Juan did alarmed the merchant. The master calmed him down, insisting that he do everything as agreed. Then, the merchant prepared a special device for cleaning. He himself was interested in how Juan would get out of the situation. Moreover, the stones Juan chose were the most ordinary ones. When the cleaning process was completed, it turned out that the ordinary stone was precious. The crowd was excited, because special armor was made from such stones. Even the merchant himself had no words to explain this. Juan secretly grinned, because such a small stone was worth a fortune. The master became worried, openly believing that Juan was just lucky. Afterwards, the master tried to leave, but Juan stopped him. After all, the returnee had one question for the appraiser. Next, paying attention to a random old man from the crowd, Juan drew attention to the vase in the old man's hands, stating that it was ordinary and also fragile. This came as a revelation to the old man. As proof, Juan asked to press on the vase. Juan reassured him, stating that the artifact could not break. The old man glanced uncertainly at the vase. After which, I pressed on the thinnest area. A crack appeared, and in a split second the vase in his hands fell apart. Seeing all this, the crowd immediately began to buzz. Now, Juan turned to the master for an explanation. Receiving no answer, Juan began to explain to the crowd that a criminal conspiracy had taken place. Having finished, he wanted to get comments from the master himself. The crowd began to discuss what they had heard. People began to recall cases of fraud en masse. The master tried to calm everyone down, attributing the situation to an accident. After his words, something broke with a crash. One of the buyers deliberately broke what he bought, making sure that he had paid for ordinary stones. One by one, the dissatisfied joined in. People slowly surrounded the master, preparing to take an explanation from him. Not even a minute had passed before the masters were already striking. After leaving the shopping district, Juan soon arrived in another place. It was a special bookstore where Juan planned to find the missing knowledge. A friendly girl met him at the entrance. The girl was surprised when Juan started talking about the 6th rank of development. She giggled and explained that the bookstore did not have such high-ranking works. In this case, Juan asked for advice on how to find the right store. The girl thought for a moment and began listing her guesses out loud. Finally, he remembered the collector who had the books Juan needed. The girl warned that the collector was a special person and invited Juan to take him there. So, they left the store together and walked along the streets. The girl warned Juan to behave especially in front of the collector, also asking Juan not to involve her in the affairs with the collector. Finally, I'll give you a couple more tips on how to best please a collector. After some time, bringing Juan to the right house. Juan never expected that the great collector would live within the city limits. Just then, a horse's hoof struck nearby. The young man on horseback made eyes and greeted the girl, but she didn't particularly reciprocate the sympathy. The young man only grinned in response and dismounted from his horse. Along the way, he warned Juan not to set his eyes on someone else's girl. And in general, the young man was interested in Juan. The girl rudely refused to answer any questions. As a result, Juan witnessed a verbal altercation between two young people. Eventually, Juan interrupted them. He made it clear that he had no plans for the girl. Juan's tone was impolite, which attracted the girl's attention. She quickly explained that the boy was not an ordinary person, but from an influential family. Juan was irritated that in the world where he had disappeared, everything was so complicated. And the girl only now realized that her words about the noble young man turned out to be nothing more than empty words for Juan. A little later, the young man knocked on the gate of the mansion, asking to take everyone to the master. The servant willingly invited guests. Slowly, their procession began to walk along the amazing courtyard. Juan even dared to speak poetically about it. The servant liked Juan's saying, especially since he appreciated the work of the collector himself. Finally, the servant brought everyone to the guest room. He asked everyone to wait inside until the owner came out. The girl was still haunted by how beautiful words Juan knew. The young man, on the contrary, believed that Juan was just showing off in front of the maiden. From this time on, the squabble between the young people started again. Their squabble continued for so long that Juan was finding it unbearable to sit. Their argument was cut short by the sound of creaking floorboards. The collector himself appeared in the guest room. The collector was immediately delighted with the way someone had spoken about that court. The collector was met by a young man who expressed his suspicions about Juan. Suddenly, the collector ordered the young man to shut up. Pushing him aside, he wanted to show Juan one picture. At his command, the servant opened the canvas. It was now that the girl began to whisper to Juan that this was how the collector carried out his checks. Juan was confused, because he didn't know that the situation in the trailer could come to this. Juan remained silent for so long that he began to arouse the collector's suspicions. Juan hoped that the astral library would help him in this situation as well. As soon as I looked into it, a miracle really happened. Then I began to wonder whether the collector really wanted an appraisal. Having received consent, Juan was ready to give his commentary. Then, calling the painting on canvas a complete nightmare, the servant tried to correct Juan, since the painting was the collector's own creation. The girl was scared to death, because in his anger, the collector spared no one. The young man was actually laughing. The collector shut up all these multiple voices with a roar, after which, his gaze became extremely serious. Juan bowed and apologized for his insolence. The collector did not hold a grudge, since the assessment was based on the work, not the person who made it. Then Juan continued, noting something in the painting that was hidden from the naked eye. The collector became interested in his words. Juan was ready to open up about this and reached into his inner pocket. From there, taking out a small knife. Then, shocking many, Juan reached for the collector's painting with the tip of his knife. Without listening to anyone, Juan cut it. The collector's eyes widened at what was happening. After all, Juan didn't just cut the painting. He revealed what was deliberately hidden from other views. All the witnesses gasped at what they saw. The collector himself was pleasantly surprised by Juan's resourcefulness. Following this, he suggests looking at a different picture. Juan reached out his hand to the painting and noted that it lacked precision, further stating that the author of the painting had never seen living animals. What Juan said slightly confused the collector. After all, everything Juan said turned out to be true. But for now, I decided to ask him in more detail about the inaccuracies. The girl was taken aback again, because the collector himself was asking some young man for advice. At the same time, Juan spoke in detail about how the beast should be depicted. The collector appreciated Juan's advice good-naturedly. Overall, I would rate Juan as being wise beyond his years. After which, the collector asked the girl to introduce Juan. She laughed out of awkwardness, since she herself practically didn't know the returnee. The collector did not appreciate this, further demanding that for his merits, Juan be called a professional. He was even ready to listen if anyone had doubts about this. No one argued, and Juan was now called a professional. Although Juan was pleased, he did not need such a title. However, the collector thought completely differently. Moreover, allowing Juan to teach the two young men on occasion. Finally, the collector was interested in the nature of Juan's visit. Without hiding anything, Juan started talking about searching for material on the 6th combat rank. The collector patted Juan on the shoulder and was ready to show off his books. Suddenly, the servant tried to stop his master. The conversation concerned the collector's office, but he was only too happy to let Juan in there. Leaving the guest room, the collector invited Juan to go to another wing. Already there, he presented his library. Unfortunately, there weren't that many of the materials Juan needed there. Many of the techniques there did not suit Juan, but he nevertheless studied all the materials. At some point, I noticed a couple of books on the shelf above. The collector sighed, calling them his son's books. But he wasn't averse to letting Juan take a look at the brutal techniques there. Juan took advantage of the opportunity with pleasure. From the side, the collector saw that Juan was studying the books unnaturally quickly, practically simply leafing through them. But for Juan, this is exactly what the reading method looked like. The ability to create a completely new work in the astral library. It was an incredibly convenient and useful process. What ultimately came out of what was read fell into Juan's hands. Immediately, he began to read the treatise there. The improvement of Juan's soul and body began immediately. Only by pumping these parameters together could Juan achieve results. Once again, the best knowledge fell into the hands of Juan. As expected, Juan gave the new type of technique a name. Then, without expecting it, Juan began the process of his own transformation. Meanwhile, the collector was worried about Juan, who stood motionless for a long time. Carefully, he touched it to make sure everything was okay. As soon as the touch took place, a violent reaction of spiritual energy arose. Immediately, this force pushed the collector away. Flying to the side, the collector rolled head over heels across the floor. Juan himself was shocked by this, but the collector recovered very quickly. Juan was already rushing to help. The collector allowed himself to be helped, but did not admit that he felt great power in Juan. Then, completely by accident, Juan slapped him on the back. A new reaction of spiritual power struck the unfortunate collector. Even Juan himself didn't understand what was happening now. He tried to help the collector again, but he was already refusing. Spitting blood, the collector guessed that Juan had moved up to a new rank. Juan reluctantly agreed. The collector understood that Juan simply had not yet had time to adapt to the new forces. And yet, Juan's rise to rank 6 was nothing short of miraculous. To sort things out, the collector invited Juan into the living room. At the same time, a couple of young people were again actively discussing Juan. The girl guessed that Juan had paid a visit to the collector, since he was literally one step away from the next rank. The young man became interested in this idea, believing that Juan could be an excellent fighter. Just then, a blood-stained collector appeared in the living room. The collector waved to the youngsters, asking them not to worry about themselves. Also, asking the servant to bring a column to measure the strength. Juan also appeared in the room, and they began to ask him about his increased powers. The young man was delighted with Juan's positive response and wanted to arrange a sparring match. Having overheard this conversation, the collector himself became interested. The girl jumped up from her seat and began to explain to the young man that the collector's house was not a place for duels. The collector himself said that he was not averse to sparring. The young man was glad that his idea was approved. After which, he assumed a fighting stance, for the sake of decency, calling on Juan to prepare for a fight. After which, the youth delivered a swift blow. Juan also raised his fist, wanting to test himself. At a certain point, both blows met. Juan clearly felt that the youth's strength was much weaker. Then, moving his hand forward, he threw the youth away. At a tremendous speed, he crashed into the wall. The collector was amazed by Juan's strength. Juan himself was worried about the fate of the young man after what happened. Moving somehow, the youth spoke up. Juan was glad to hear that, suggesting that this time they both give it their all. Suddenly, the young man began to refuse, recognizing the professional as a much stronger fighter. Juan gnashed his teeth because he thought the young man was simply being lazy. It was just now that the servant who announced the installation of the column appeared. He gasped when he saw the youth slammed into the wall. The collector also spoke up, urging Juan to test his strength. Juan himself did not consider this to be particularly necessary. However, the collector stubbornly insisted otherwise. Sighing and agreeing, Juan approached the column. Taking a deep breath, Juan struck with all his might. The pole rattled and a number appeared on it. Juan showed the results. However, for some reason, shock appeared on the faces of the witnesses. Juan did not understand them, and then the girl suggested taking another look at the column. Juan turned around and looked surprised. The power figure on the column changed by 10 values at once. Juan even doubted whether the column was in good working order. The collector was completely confident that Juan had indeed advanced to the 6th rank of strength. For everyone else, this news came as a surprise, and Juan himself experienced unusual feelings. After all, with such development, every corner of the body would strengthen it. Juan refused to believe in rank increase, reducing everything to strengthening the body itself. The collector did not expect to receive such an answer. He even suggested that Juan might have eaten some red fruit. Juan remembered that he had actually eaten something similar at the market. The collector explained that Juan owed his power to a special fruit. About half an hour had passed since their conversation. Having settled down, the collector started talking about Juan himself. The returnee admitted that he was a teacher. Upon learning of this, the collector wanted the young people to study with Juan. But only a young man from a wealthy family received this news with joy. Be that as it may, Juan could not stay any longer. Before saying goodbye, the collector promised to help Juan find the books he needed. Juan thanked him. The collector liked the flattery and said goodbye. This is how Juan's visit to the famous collector ended. Walking through the streets of the city, he reflected on his strength. Juan wondered if there were other ways to strengthen himself. But then a rustling sound from the alley caught his attention. Juan stopped, loudly ordering his pursuer to show himself. Leading strong guys, he proved himself to be a master. The master was angry and wanted revenge. Such threats did not affect Juan at all. All his actions showed that he didn't care. And in general, as a returnee, Juan did not want to waste time on such things. Juan's attitude infuriated the master, and he eventually gave orders. Immediately, a huge guy approached Juan. The master was already anticipating how the big guy would smear Juan on the ground. The big guy was about to do just that, spreading his arms and concentrating his strength in them. A second later, his powerful palms rushed towards Juan's head. Unexpectedly, Juan took hold of certain parts of the big man's body. He squeezed them so hard that the big guy was pierced by incredible pain. Unable to bear it any longer, he began to scream. Juan himself perceived the big guy as an opportunity to test his strength on someone. Pulling him towards himself, Juan hit the big guy with his palm. Then he pulled his hand back and pushed sharply. With new spiritual strength, the big guy was thrown back somewhere. The master and his protégés were impressed by Juan's powers. Some people no longer wanted to beat Juan at all, but there were also daredevils among them. The master was lucky that one of the merchants was of the 6th rank. He was counting on Juan being in trouble now. Having prepared himself, the merchant activated Falcon's flight. Other merchants believed that few could resist such an ability, and the master himself was counting on a quick victory. At some point, like a bird of prey, the merchant soared above Juan. Juan himself was not impressed. After all, to defeat such a technique, he didn't even need an astral library. The merchant himself was confident of his victory until he heard a crunch, and then a plaintive groan was heard. The previously confident merchant received a kick from Juan in his most vulnerable spot. Juan's victory was absolute, so the master called on everyone to attack Juan together. On his orders, all the dissatisfied people rushed to Juan. Juan was once again unimpressed. Moreover, the master himself disappeared somewhere after giving the order to attack. Looking back, they saw him running away. Everyone was of the same opinion that the master was a treacherous man. And yet, 2 more traitors still remained. With a lightning-fast move, Juan neutralized the techs. After which he rushed after the master himself. At some point, not only catching up with him, but even overtaking him. Juan lifted his leg as he ran, with all his might, hitting the master straight on. That one was stopped. Juan scoffed, imagining that the master had expected a completely different turn of events. Having come to his senses a little, the master began to plead, begging Juan to spare himself. Juan smiled, first deciding to find out how much the master's life was worth. Hearing this, the master frantically began to remove the unusual ring from his finger. The strange decoration interested Juan. With the help of the astral library, he immediately learned that the ring could serve as something like a spatial storage. Deciding to explore what could be there, Juan began to put on the ring. Immediately, a certain process started. Suddenly, Juan was transported inside a compact treasury. The master hoped that such a gift would appease Juan's anger. Evasively, Juan agreed to this. But first, I wanted to get much more from the master. The master did not understand how exactly Juan recognized that he had more money hidden under his clothes. Laughing demonically, Juan reached out to the master. In the next couple of minutes, the master lost everything he had on him. Subsequently, the master was upset that he had been treated so rudely. Juan paid no attention to him, greedily counting the proceeds. Still, the master hoped that Juan would keep his word. Looking at him, Juan began to list the master's sins. The master was amazed that Huan knew absolutely everything about it. The master even tried to find an explanation for Huan's knowledge, but was unable to do so. And Huan himself considered reasoning about his knowledge to be a waste of time. Now, I intend to make sure that the master never again causes grief to others. Suddenly, Huan struck with his knee. But all his actions were not aimed at killing the master. In this way, Huan somehow deprived him of the opportunity to deceive further. The master himself felt how he instantly lost all his skills. After which, the action moved to some unknown villa. There, Shan diligently tried to convince his grandfather of something, and also find out about the situation with the lion. Next, he started pointing at the lion. Shan complained that the lion almost killed him. Shan's grandfather was also interested in the beast's behavior. However, the lion himself was as detached as possible from talking about himself. Shana's grandfather promised that he would look into the situation. Shan begged his grandfather to teach Huan a lesson as well. Waving his hand, the grandfather promised to deal with this too. Meanwhile, Shan's grandfather couldn't just fire Huan, but Shang already had a plan, and it concerned Huang's disciple named Io. Shang claimed that Io had studied with Huang under deception and coercion. Shang considered this fact sufficient to remove Huang. Grandfather Shana expressed interest in the information, announcing that an investigation was being conducted, giving his word to remove Huang if Shan's story was confirmed. Shang was happy, believing that he was one step away from defeating Huang. Immediately after this, the action returned to Huan himself. He had already returned to his school, continuing to ponder ways of developing strength. Lost in thought, he pushed the doors. Inside, Huan's students were waiting for him. The returnee never expected such a meeting. Unexpectedly, the students began to greet Huan in chorus. Huan was reciprocal, although he did not understand their joy. Next, turning to Nika, asking her to be first, Huan gave the girl herbs that were supposed to heal her. Opening the chest, Nika saw rare medicinal plants inside. Next, Huan distributed specially prepared development techniques to everyone else. Each student received their own manual. The students immediately began to study the manuals they had received. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. Moreover, the author of the text was Huan himself. Before Huan had time to give names to the new techniques, he shifted this responsibility to his students. Urgently, surprised glances were directed at Huan. None of those present could have dreamed of such an honor. For this reason, Huana even decided to ask Nick about his decision. Huan did not renounce his previous words. The situation that Huan had now created was truly unique. For the first time in history, a teacher created individual teaching aids. Such generosity could not remain unanswered. One by one, the disciples began to fall on their knees before Huang. Among them, Nika even took a solemn oath of allegiance to the teacher. Huan was confused by the fact that the students swore not only to study, but even to protect their mentor. At the same time, Mila was wandering thoughtfully near the school walls. She kept trying to find a way to meet with Huan. In the end, I decided to just visit him. Confidently, she walked towards the school gates. At that moment, Yao was there. Mila saw this man for the first time. Yao didn't introduce himself, and on the contrary, threatened Mila not to interfere in other people's affairs. Mila responded insolently, mentally suggesting that the strange man could have been sent by Shan himself. She remembered very well the threats of reprisals against Huang. Subsequently, Mila even openly spoke out about the inadmissibility of such intentions. Yao himself guessed that the famous beauty teacher was talking to him now. A minute later, their conflict became much more heated. A couple more unflattering words addressed to each other, and now both characters have moved on. Their fight began. At the same time, not far from Huang's school, Shang was walking with Chao. Shan boasted that he had managed to negotiate the removal of his opponent. Chao fully supported Shang's aspirations. Moreover, Shan expected that such a step would definitely turn the beautiful Mila away from the loser Huan. Then Shan began to laugh, promising a reward to everyone who supported him. Suddenly, Cao interrupted him, almost forcibly pointing somewhere. Both witnessed a fight between Yao and Mila. Looking at this, Cao even suggested that the beauty wanted to take revenge on Yao for beating Shang. Cao backed up his words with the confidence that the calm and level-headed teacher would never have gotten into a fight just like that. After hearing everything, something sank in Shan's heart. For the first time, he imagined that he could be liked by someone, and especially by Mila herself. Then his body was engulfed in uncontrollable flames. As quickly as possible, he began to rush to help Mila defeat Yao. Yao glanced to the side and saw Shang approaching rapidly. Mila also saw this furtively, but she was not sure that Shan had come to help her. And then, breaking the chain of battle, Shang flew between the fighters. Jumping to the side, Mila was already imagining how she would have to fight against two opponents at once. However, Shan turned his back to the beauty. Screaming hysterically, he began to threaten Yao with violence. At that very moment, his raised fist was intercepted by a seasoned fighter. You began to beat and spank Shang in every humiliating way. All this went on for so long that Cao was even forced to ask Mila to save Shang. Cao assured that otherwise, Shan would simply be beaten to death. Mila chuckled in displeasure and finally began to approach the fighters. Yao clearly saw the woman approaching. Feeling his strength weakening, he pushed Shan away, deciding to retreat. But first, he promised to definitely return and finish what he started. After which, he jumped off somewhere. Even though Mila intervened, she still believed that they were simply trying to take her for a fool. At that very moment, the gates of Huan's school swung open. Looking displeased, Huan wanted to know what the crowd of people were doing at the entrance to that school. With some difficulty, I opened my eyes and heard Shan's unintelligible whisper. Cao spoke up instead, unleashing a barrage of accusations on Huang, also mentioning a certain will detector, whose test Huan was required to pass. Thanks to the astral library, Huan knew that the will detector could tell if someone was truly studying against their will. Cao warned Huang that it was simply impossible to refuse this procedure without being fired. Worried about Huan and sensing a catch, Mila asked him to refuse. However, Huan unexpectedly agreed to this challenge. Absolutely everyone was puzzled by his answer. After which, Huan began to call his student Io. Cao had confidence in Io, still considering him his loyal disciple. At the same time, Mila was angry because Huan had agreed without foresight. Their conversation was cut short, because it was then that Io appeared. Mila was upset by Huang's decision, because the Shang family was not only rich, but also powerful. Being sure that everything was happening because of her, Mila decided not to stand aside. Thus, all the characters reached the will detector tower. There, Shan's grandfather asked the elder for forgiveness for disturbing him. The elder asked to leave thanks, as he was glad to participate in the investigation. Then, the elder was presented with a short story about Huan himself. Shan's grandfather himself was shocked that Huan turned out to be such a dishonest person. After hearing the story, the elder agreed that the use of the will detector was mandatory. This was exactly the answer that Grandfather Shana wanted to hear. At that very moment, the door inside the tower began to open. Shan showed up, bringing everyone else with him. Taking a closer look at Shan, his grandfather was horrified. His grandson was terribly beaten and could barely move his lips. As quickly as possible, the grandfather reached into his inside pocket to give his grandson some medicine. Taking the opportunity, Cao addressed the elder directly. He outlined the essence of his claims against Huan in as much detail as possible. It came as a surprise to Io that he was dragged to some kind of test. Now Huan spoke up, calling all the accusations against him false. Huan began to justify himself as pitifully as possible. As quietly as possible, Huan began to hint to Io to play along. Thinking that the teacher wanted to deceive everyone, Io began to feign fear. In a trembling voice, he said that Huan did not force anyone to be a student. After listening to him, the elder was ready to forgive Huan, but only if he repented. Hearing this, Shan began to protest, because he had hoped for the procedure to be carried out. His words were actively supported by Cao. Under such pressure, the elder agreed. Next, Shan's grandfather spoke up, explaining that if Huan was found guilty, he would have to leave the school. Meanwhile, for the sake of fairness, guaranteeing the dismissal of the plaintiff if Huan's guilt is not proven. Considering exile too cruel, Huan proposed an alternative in the form of flogging. Huan's words shocked everyone, because it was he and no one else who was in danger. The elder himself was attracted by Huan's conditions, especially since, according to them, the loser would also lose his teaching license. In his mind, Cao was glad that Huang had effectively dug his own grave. Mila was at a loss, not understanding Huan's actions. As the chief prosecutor, Cao ultimately agreed with Huang's idea. Io was worried, and at the same time admired his teacher's extraordinary idea. When the chatter ended, the elder announced the beginning of the test. Then, waving his hands, he summoned a levitating stone. The elder explained that touching the stone would determine the level of trust. Smiling, Cao was already imagining how insignificant a defeated Huang would look. Now he invited Io to step onto the podium. Afterwards, Cao and Io placed their palms on the ball. Immediately the ball began to emit a glow, indicating the reading process. The elder really hoped that no mistake would happen and the truth would be revealed. Meanwhile, Shan's grandfather reminded that only in exceptional cases was trust as high as 100%. Before the trial was over, Mila tried to convince Huan to leave the academy to avoid humiliation. Shang heard the beauty's pleas, declaring that Huan would no longer be able to escape easily. He almost laughed out loud at the thought of the trap Huan had led himself into. But then Huan asked whether Shang himself was confident of his victory. Shang laughed out loud, completely believing in the high level of trust between Cao and Io. All this time, Mila was amazed at how calmly Huan behaved. While the process was going on, Grandfather Shana started a conversation with the elder. The elder believed that, as his first teacher, Cao had more trust in Io. He agreed with everything that was said. At some point, the first results began to appear. Cao was reveling in joy, already anticipating how everything would return to normal. Finally, the number 10 came into view for all to see. Such a low value for Cao was a real shame. Juan's laughter echoed through the hall. And for everyone else, Io's trust in Cao turned out to be much lower than expected. Shan's grandfather could barely contain his anger, realizing that his grandson had dragged him into a game that was no longer his best. Cao himself did not lose hope, believing that he had much more trust than Huang. Juan took such speeches absolutely calmly, after which he himself followed to the podium. Subsequently, a new stage of trust assessment began. Not even a minute had passed before the ball gave its results. The observers caught their breath, because no one had ever seen such results before. The enormous number 64 jumped out across the entire hall. This meaning shocked absolutely everyone. Io trusted Juan almost as if he were his own parent. The truth was so painful that Shan even clutched his heart. Even the elder noted how great the degree of trust Io had in Huang was. Mila was also completely delighted, because only great teachers could achieve such a result. Finally, Juan spoke up, indicating that he had won the argument. Cao immediately screamed, claiming that the test had been rigged. Shan actively supported his words. Shan supported his speech with facts that only great teachers could win over students in such a way. However, seeing Io's gaze, the elder thought completely differently. Then he barked at the two young men, because they dared to doubt the results of the test. Juan also spoke up, demanding that the conditions of the test be met. Shang's grandfather tried to defend Cao, trying to convince Huang that there was no need for revenge. Juan flatly disagreed with this. Naturally, Juan's behavior outraged grandfather Shan. Cao also tried not to remain silent on the sidelines. He tried to prove that Juan had fooled everyone, and in particular, Io's student. And soon he even began to claim that one of Juan's former students had gone mad. It was for this reason that Cao allegedly cared so much about Io's fate. At some point, his active speech found a response in the soul of the elder. Shan's grandfather agreed with Chao's words, believing that Huang did not even have the necessary knowledge. Juan's voice was heard insisting on the terms of the deal being followed, no matter who or what they thought. In fact, refusing to fulfill his part of the agreement. Shan's grandfather contradicted him. Mila found it surprising that everyone was turning against Juan again. At some point, unable to bear it any longer, she began to accuse those around her of lacking honor. At the moment of their general argument, the door inside the tower opened again. The servant who entered informed the elder that someone wished to see him. There was nothing left to do but accept the unexpected guests. After all, a representative of one of the 4 great clans came to the meeting. It was strange to Shan that such influential people attended a martial arts school. Grandfather Shana laughed, thinking that it was all because of Tao. He believed that the clan leader had come to thank him for teaching him. Only now did Huang learn that Shan's grandfather was the teacher of that very Tao. Mila believed that Huan could have found himself in a very dangerous situation. However, the returnee did not express even a drop of fear. Once again, Huan ignored any warnings. Soon, the head of the Lita family entered the tower. He greeted Grandfather Shan in a very friendly manner. After shaking hands, the head of the family admitted that he had come on business. Afterwards, he started mentioning Huan. It was very fortunate that Huan was very close. Shang and Chao hoped that now, at least, Huang would get what he deserved for his deception. Huan himself frowned, calmly waiting while the head of the clan confidently walked towards him. Unexpectedly, the clan leader knelt down in front of Huang. Everyone was stunned, because they expected something completely different. Their plan was for Huan to receive claims, not recognition. At the same time, Huan asked the clan leader to rise from his knees. The head of the clan was immensely grateful to Huan for treating Lita, and also for teaching her. Huan laughed, explaining everything as his duty. Seeing this scene, the elder changed his opinion of Huan to positive. Now he had no doubt why Io trusted his teacher so much. However, noting that Lita's recovery could not have been the reason for the clan leader's visit, the clan leader confirmed these words with a laugh. So, without delay, he started talking about his son. Next, he took out a certain gift, as a token of gratitude for teaching Tao. Grandfather Shan refused the gift, but only in order not to lose face in front of the elder. Afterwards, the clan leader wanted Tao to be released. Hearing this, Grandfather Shan's eyes twitched. He didn't even know how to respond to such a request. And yet he could not refuse the head of the clan. After which, he performed the ritual of releasing Tao from his students, further demonstrating that everything was completed. Thanks. The clan leader took the registration stone from him. Immediately after this, asking Huan to take Tao to his class. Once again, everyone was amazed by what they heard. This change almost killed Shan's grandfather. With each passing second, the situation became more and more unpredictable. Moreover, Juan decided to think about this matter, after which he completely refused this request. For the first time, such a request was refused to a member of an influential family. Many thought that Juan simply made a bad joke. Juan's refusal once again caused pain in Grandfather Shan's chest, and the elder didn't know what to think about Juan in this regard. Once again, Juan repeated that he refused. After all, the returnee remembered very well how Tao attacked him. The clan leader tried to persuade Juan to change his mind. It was at this moment that Chao's hysterical cry was heard. He insisted that Juan's refusal was not so simple. Chao claimed that Huang's martial arts rank was the lowest among the teachers. These words were also supported by Shan. Even Shan's grandfather thought that learning from such a low-ranking teacher was not suitable for Tao. The widespread statements planted a seed of doubt within the clan leader. Chao continued to belittle Huang, believing that he could only surprise someone like a newcomer. His words were fully supported by Shana's grandfather. The clan leader was at a crossroads, claiming that Huang had stopped the sword's movement with 2 fingers. Those who heard this laughed, considering it impossible. Moreover, a person whose combat training level was 3rd could not stop the sword. Here Io spoke up, standing up to defend this story. Naturally, no one took the student's words seriously. Just as they were trying to convince the head of the clan that the whole story was fictitious, the servant entered the room again. As it turned out, another person appeared who also wanted to see Huan. Grandfather Shan was infuriated that Huang was so famous. The servant said with a certain fear that it was none other than the son of Inai, the son of the king himself, who had appeared. Immediately, the servant received an order to invite him. Meanwhile, the elder began to wonder what could unite Huan and Inaya. Mila was completely shocked by Huan's acquaintances like these. Soon, Inai himself entered the tower. The first thing he did was greet Huan as a professional. The returnee was not particularly happy about his visit. Quickly jumping up to Huan, Inai asked him to teach him some wisdom before the young man left. All witnesses of this scene fell silent, suppressing their envy. At some point, unable to bear it any longer, Shan's grandfather began cursing at Huan. Inai frowned, silently listening to the filth that Grandfather Shan poured on Huan. At some point, unable to bear it any longer, he sent the impudent Grandfather Shan away. He threatened that in case of disobedience, he would order the execution of Shan's grandfather. The other's indignation was so great that the entire structure of the tower literally began to shake. This was the first time Grandfather Shana had encountered such resistance. Moreover, Inai called Huan an equal to his mentor. Even the elder was perplexed by such speeches. Inai continued to defend Huan, describing his great powers. After hearing all this, Grandfather Shana no longer had any words to say against it. Inai spared him, warning that Huan himself might not be so merciful. After these words, all eyes fell on Huan. In response, Huan only grinned, not trying to demonstrate his true strength. After a couple of seconds of waiting, the clan leader spoke again, asking for his son Tao. His words made Inaya nervous, as if he was about to take away someone else's place. With a sigh, Huan allowed Tao to come and attend the lecture. The words that he would be a free listener and not a student again caused pain to Grandfather Shan. Inai was glad that his appearance had somehow managed to defuse the situation. At the same time, Huan again raised the issue of the recent deal. Cao's voice came in response. The red-haired man claimed that Huan would fail. For some reason, he was sure that his teaching license would not be revoked. Cao knew that for something like this to happen, compelling events were needed. Then laughing, Cao declared that he had become a teacher before Huang and was much more successful. Huan decided to find out if Chao's words were really true. The elder agreed that it was impossible to revoke the license simply because of a dispute. Huan was disappointed, now not understanding why he had taken part in all this at all. However, the elder knew one way to revoke someone's teaching license. Then the elder spoke about a certain grandmaster and his decision. It was the first time Huan had heard of anything like this. Then I started thinking about where to find such a person. Just after this, the servant knocked on the door of the room again. He mentioned the name of a certain girl, which brought delight to Inaya's face. The elder ordered that she be let inside. A pretty girl began to enter the tower. On the way, she greeted the elder. Then, passing by all the others, she bowed to Huan. It was Anga, who, by a happy coincidence, was the assistant of the Grandmaster himself. With each passing second, the situation developed so unfavorably that Shana's grandfather was in despair. The others were once again discouraged by Huan's acquaintances. Huan recognized the girl who ran the bookstore. Luckily for him, she was just the person he needed. A little later, Ange was told about the situation surrounding Huan, so now the girl doubted that Cao deserved a teacher's license. Her words literally knocked Cao off his feet. Cao was at a loss, because now he was in danger of losing everything. Just one decision saved Cao from poverty and loss of authority. He couldn't forgive himself that the situation had gotten this bad because of that lousy Huan. But Cao certainly had no intention of giving up. So he again began to threaten Huan to reveal the secret about his former students. Huan didn't care about this, because Cao was doomed anyway. Huang's attitude towards the situation as a whole had a painful impact on Cao, after which, due to the shock he experienced, he completely lost consciousness. Then, Huan began to threaten Shan. Shan's grandfather also spoke up, confirming that previously, Huang had only terrible indicators. Such criticism again raised doubts among Huan's allies. Huan himself was silently angry, never expecting that the past would be used as a weapon. However, Huan could not afford to lose and end up on the street. This meant that there was no longer any need to hide one's strength. So Huan started by coughing to attract attention. Mila interrupted him, voicing that she understood everything. Then publicly, she told how Huang had outdone Old Man Mo with his knowledge. The new arrivals supported her with their examples. So Mila now had doubts about her previous assessment of Huan's abilities. The clan leader maintained his doubts, as testing of new teachers was always secret. In the end, Mila accused Shan's grandfather of falsification. The elder was confused, because the situation was approaching a conflict among the teachers. In his eyes, he increasingly considered Huan to be something like an uncut diamond. This was evident not only from Huan's intelligence, but also from his restraint towards any insults. After the charges were brought, Shan's grandfather was completely lost. Huan was also in shock, not expecting that everything could turn out like this. At the same time, Shan's grandfather denied the accusations. The elder thought differently, seeing the intent as helping his grandson. Now, having sided with Huan, the elder assumed that Huan was being humiliated so that he would not overshadow Shang. One by one, everyone started supporting Huan. Grandfather Shana did not know what to answer, because in fact, he had never met Huan before. It turned out that now the villain was Shang, and all those who helped him. Grandfather Shan's hatred was great. At some point, this poison turned against him. Others did not pay much attention to his suffering. Shan had no answer as to how something like this could change so abruptly. After the attack, Grandfather Shana himself seemed to be reborn. For a moment, his body was filled with euphoria. Coming to his senses, he boldly addressed Huan, once again deciding to play the card with the sad fate of Huan's student, and he demanded that Huan give his answer. Huan was silent for a while, because he really had committed such a crime. While demanding a confession from Huan, Shan's grandfather also ordered his servant to bring someone. Huan's supporters were now waiting to see what would happen next. Huan himself briefly reminisced about the incident. At the same time, Grandfather Shana spoke again, making it clear that the student who had gone crazy had been helped. The clan leader listened to Grandfather Shan's story with interest. After some time, the servant returned to the tower, bringing with him the infamous Feng. After exchanging greetings, Feng was pointed towards Huang. Shan's grandfather wondered if Feng recognized him. Feng frowned and called Huang his former teacher. Further, he readily confirmed that Huan had once ruined his life. Having received the evidence, Grandfather Shana now turned to the elder. But the elder had already heard enough, and Huan's guilt was now proven. Of all those gathered, no one had the words to stand up for Huan. Huan also remained meekly silent, although everyone expected him to start defending himself. Unexpectedly, Huan admitted the charges. This action was unexpected for Grandfather Shan. Huan publicly did not deny his guilt for what happened. Grandfather Shan considered these words, and the attitude towards him for the offense, to be another example of Huan's arrogant behavior. His speech was interrupted by Huang, who asked Grandfather Shang not to be so expressive. Huan reminded that given his opponent's age, nerves could have a negative effect on his heart. Next, Huang turned to Feng, asking him to demonstrate what he had learned. Feng was taken aback by this request, because everyone in this place had not gathered for this purpose. Even Ang tried to remind Huan that Feng's training was not up for discussion. Feng spoke up and began to talk about Huang's incorrect teaching methods. Huan himself did not want to hear such a thing, still insisting on demonstrating the fighter's strength. In the end, Feng agreed, after which he performed a series of blows. Watching Feng, others found him to be quite talented. Among them, only Shan's grandfather tried to comprehend what Huan was trying to achieve with this request, immediately noticing that Huan didn't even look at the demonstration of skills. Moreover, at this moment, Feng also stopped demonstrating his strength. After what the young fighter said, Huan opened his eyes. Immediately, Shan's grandfather tried to bring the matter with Huan to an end. However, Huan stopped him as he had some words to say in his defense, after saying that he drove Feng crazy on purpose. This news shook the tower. What Huan said was another reason for Shan's grandfather to accuse him of incompetence. The elder had no comment on this matter. Anga also remained silent, saying that she wanted to help Huan, but could not. Feng clenched his fists in anger at what he heard. He demanded angrily to know why Huan had done this to him. Huan, in turn, pretended that no one understood. This kind of attitude towards himself only fueled Feng's hatred. At the same time, Huan asked if the others hadn't understood anything either. Then, Huan decided to explain that Feng had some congenital problems. After hearing the details, Anga understood that when Feng was ill, fighters often did not progress. The elder was interested in Huan's conclusion. Feng doubted Huan's words, because during his training, he did not feel any discomfort. In that case, Huang asked Feng certain leading questions. Somehow, Huan had anticipated the unpleasant sensations that Feng was experiencing. All the other people present listened to their dialogue. Grandfather Shan didn't understand what Huan was getting at, since all of this was irrelevant. Huan responded to this with a complaint, wanting to know how the madman was characterized. In response, Shana's grandfather gave a description of this ailment. He hoped that Huang wouldn't say that he drove Feng crazy in order to destroy the disease. Many considered this process risky and unlikely. Huan didn't answer, turning his attention and questions back to Feng. Somewhat afraid of his words, Feng replied that he no longer had the same feeling of constraint. Then, loudly proclaiming, Huan began to explain what Feng's strength and misfortune were. Now Huan concluded that, after leaving, Feng had not managed to completely get rid of the illness, although he had succeeded in some things. Shan's grandfather spoke out against this absurd story. No matter how Huan tried to dodge or justify himself, the experienced old man did not believe him. But Huan didn't need trust, always turning his attention to Feng. Feng spoke up, voicing his teacher's hopes for a quick transition to a new combat rank. Others present found teacher Feng's achievements worthy of a professional. However, Huang found Feng's development period to be excessively long. In front of everyone, he promised to help Feng move up to the next rank in just half an hour. No one present believed that such a thing was possible. In particular, Shan's grandfather spoke out against Huan's words. Huan was not surprised that they didn't believe him. Unlike everyone else, Feng was in a state of confusion. Moreover, Huan insisted on his help, guaranteeing results. Feng made up his mind, because Huan was able to correctly diagnose him in one go. At some point, he finally agreed to the experiment. Huan was pleased with this decision. After which, asking Feng to strictly follow his recommendations. A second later, Feng assumed a pose on the floor. Slowly, Huan reached into the inside pocket of his robe. I took out a needle from there. Feeling that unusual spiritual power, Huan swung. Next, sticking the needle somewhere in the area of Feng's crown. Somewhere in the wilds of Feng's spiritual threads, processes began to unfold. A couple of minutes later, he began his power transition period. Feng felt new power seeping through his vessels. Realizing that he was incredibly fast, he managed to move straight to the second rank. The witnesses gasped at what they saw. For almost everyone, what they saw was something out of science fiction. And Feng himself, having become stronger than before, now bowed to Huang. He bitterly regretted that he had once left Huan. The clan leader even regretted that he had not met a teacher like Huan in his youth. At some point, he dared to ask to take him as a student of Huana. Inai pushed him away because he himself wanted to study with Huan. For the sake of knowledge, Inai was ready to do anything, even give up his noble title. All these speeches greatly embarrassed Huan. So he returned his attention to Feng. The student asked Huan for forgiveness for having treated him badly before. Having heard enough, Huan decided to ask others what they thought. Grandfather Shana stuttered, unable to find the right words. Moreover, the elder no longer wanted to hear anything. Next, passing a harsh sentence on Chao. At the same time, they revoked Shan's license, since he was in criminal collusion with Cao. The elder even removed Grandfather Shan from his position as director of the educational institution. He immediately fell to his knees, realizing that the affair on the part of his grandson was to blame for everything. Finally, the elder apologized to Huan. Huan accepted them, but did not hold a grudge. After which, the elder promised to take the entire situation under personal control. In the end, all but a couple of the tower's guests left. Subsequently, the scene moved to the city. For some unknown reason there, Huan was being followed closely by Inai and Anga. At some point, Huan inquired about the possibility of becoming a disciple of the Grand Master himself. Anga explained that this opportunity was entirely due to luck. Considering that Anga was the Grand Master's assistant, Huan couldn't help but ask about the fate of the girl's bookstore. Laughing, the girl made it clear that she was developing the one, but on the advice of the Grand Master. Subsequently, Huan wanted to know why the collector sent two young men to study with him. Inai spoke, explaining that it was a kind of competition. Thus, Huan learned about the painting, which was the prize in the competition. The painting was not really needed by the young people, who were rather participating in the collector's games for fun. Next, asking Huan to share his wisdom about art. Huan was put in a difficult position, because in fact, he owed all his knowledge only to the astral library. Unexpectedly, the scene moved to another place. In a distant academy, two noblemen discussed the principles of education. One of them was a teacher, receiving pleasant praise in his address. In particular, after graduation, most of the students remained with that. However, Teacher Lu wanted to know the real reason for visiting him. Laughing, his interlocutor started talking about some kind of help that was needed. Lu wasn't very happy when something like that came up in conversation. Without hesitation, the man across from him called out Huan's name. As it turned out, Lu had heard something about it. His interlocutor also knew Huan, especially after the commotion he had caused in someone else's tavern. Lu didn't understand what the problem was, believing that Huan would soon be fired. The tavern owner also believed this, hoping that Lu would lure Huang's disciples to his side. This idea even caused a proud laugh from the tavern owner. In this way, he planned to further humiliate Huan. The tavern keeper reminded Lu that people like Huang should not be given the opportunity to teach anyone. In the end, Lu agreed with the plan that was voiced. Just now, from the side, someone approached the two men. It was one of Lu's students. The disciple bore the name Wang, being the grandson of the clan head. After the greeting, the student was embarrassed to say anything for a long time. Lu thought the student had some problems and was willing to listen. Both men waited to hear what Wang would say. Suddenly, Wang wanted to leave Lu's class. Lu was shocked, because everyone, on the contrary, was trying to get into that class. Wang explained that this was the wish of the clan leader. Lu was offended by this and even began to threaten Wang. Wang and his family understood the consequences, hoping to become Huang's disciples. Of course, Lu was shocked when he heard this. The tavern owner also did not understand what could have caused this decision. Then, Lu began to tell Wang how Huang was able to drive his students crazy. Right now, Feng has appeared. Lu demanded that Feng tell the whole truth about Huan. Suddenly, Feng also fell to his knees, begging for his release. The current situation was as strange as possible for Lu. Moreover, Feng began to speak about Huan in the most positive way possible. Lu was shocked to hear this, and yet he let the disciples go. They were now happy to attend Huan's lectures. Before Lu could even look back, his former students had vanished into thin air. From now on, Lu had a reason to settle personal scores with Huan. At the same time, calling another one of his students. Somewhere a barely perceptible step was heard. A voice came from the shadows, ready to listen to its teacher. Lu explained that the student would go to Huan and give him a letter declaring war. It was something new for the tavern keeper to hear. Lu did not hear this, being immersed in thoughts of revenge against Huan, who dared to lure away the students. However, Lu was confident of his victory. Moreover, he planned to enlist the support of the Grand Master himself. Following this conversation, events returned to Huan's school. The students were worried about his long absence. At some random moment, the doors inside the school were destroyed. A man burst inside, literally hovering above the ground. He wanted to know where Huan was. The returnee's disciples came out to meet him, not being delighted that the unknown person had brought destruction. Nika asked her friends to control themselves, because the man hovering above the ground was the famous Asher. Asher was pleased to hear about himself, so he passed on letters from his master to Huan. It turned out that Lu had called Huan in for an assessment, explaining that Huan had somehow managed to anger Lu. Throwing the letter at the feet of the students, Asher voiced that Huan was even given the opportunity to avoid everything by apologizing. Then he said goodbye, but Io was stopped. The guy insisted on an apology from Asher, since his visit had caused an insult. Asher chuckled in response. Next, he performed a swift reverse movement in the form of a dance. A terrible blow hit Io, who flew into a building. Thus, Asher made it clear that he would not apologize. Nika stepped forward, wanting to teach the impudent man a lesson. Using the pain shock technique, she tried to hit Asher's vulnerable areas, but all her attacks unfortunately missed. As a result, he also received a crushing kick. The fat man tried to do something, but Asher had already acted ahead of him, sliding between his legs, hitting him straight in the chin. Seeing that her friends were beaten, Lita rushed to their aid. She didn't even notice how Asher caught up with her. He was about to strike down the girl when Io suddenly appeared again. His bold and hate-filled attack was easily stopped by Asher. Asher chuckled and noted that Io clearly lacked training. Then, as if educating him, he began to attack furiously. Io defended himself, not having the opportunity to respond for a second. Until in the end, he was knocked out again. Asher watched in silence as somewhere out there, Io collapsed, concluding that Juan's students were more like a bunch of scum. His bullying stopped when Juan arrived at school. Asher ignored him, blaming Juan for the defeat. Juan sent Asher away, informing him that he had accepted Lu's challenge. Juan blamed himself for having brought the situation to this point without foresight. Asher took Juan's words in his heart and said goodbye to him. Afterwards, the fat man, having come to his senses, spoke up, explaining that the students could not have acted differently. Before he had gone far, Asher thought that they would surely want to arrange a rematch for him. Asher was all for demonstrating his power once again. Juan also wanted to know the students' opinions about this. Besides, Juan assured that the fat man had every chance of doing something like this. Smiling, Juan promised to demonstrate one technique that would definitely bring victory. The students didn't expect to hear anything like this. In just a split second, their faith in their teacher was revived. Hearing that the fat man wanted revenge, Asher laughed out loud. And yet, Asher even promised to compensate for all losses if he was defeated. Asher believed in himself and was sure that no one would be able to defeat him. Juan also laughed, signifying what had been said, how it was possible for the students to earn it. As a candidate for victory, choosing a fat man, Asher sighed, seeing how ridiculous the choice Juan had made was. But first of all, Juan had to teach the fat man a special blow. Unsure, the fat man hesitated. Io supported the fat man, asking him to believe the teacher. Realizing that he had already been beaten once, the fat man decided to try again. Juan spoke, asking his students to watch carefully. After which, I started to perform the movements. Juan showed how to perform attacks and defensive moves. Just a couple of actions later, Juan was finished. His students did not know what to think, because the actions performed were the simplest. Asher was also not delighted with the technique demonstrated. The fat man was sad. It seemed to him that Juan was trying to send him to certain defeat. And yet, being strong-willed, he stepped towards Asher. Just in case, Asher even made sure that the fat man wanted to fight him. Having received a positive answer, Asher jumped forward. The fat man stopped. Remembering what Juan had shown, he assumed a fighting stance. With every second, Asher was getting closer to it. Seeing Juan's movements, he was going to easily get around them. The fat man himself began a counterattack, trying not to let the teacher down. Asher skillfully dodged the first swing of the fist, but the second one ignored it, since the movement did not look threatening. And then the fat man poked Asher in a vulnerable spot. It is unclear how, but it hits just the right point in life. Gasping in unbearable pain, Asher fell to the ground. The fat man was about to give him a good beating, but Asher suddenly began to plead. He tried to say something but was interrupted. The most brutal blows were heard falling on him. The other students were amazed at how strong the fat man had become in an instant. Juan called out to the fat man, reminding him that he shouldn't have killed anyone. The fat man stopped and agreed with the teacher. The beaten Asher himself could hardly believe that he had been defeated so easily. The fat man did not understand his indignation, suggesting that he try the techniques on himself. Juan asked the fat man to calm down and called the next student. Now, Juan invited Jung to train. The beaten Asher did not expect that he would continue to be tortured, but his pride did not allow him to beg for mercy. Having defeated Jung once, he believed he could do it again. Remembering the teacher's words, Jung began to act. Using spiritual energy, Jung practically flew towards Asher. An attacking move was performed, which Asher easily intercepted. Smiling, he was not about to make the same mistake again. Following which, he punched me in the face. It just so happened that Jung managed to deceive him. The injury he received enraged Asher and he tried to take revenge. But as soon as he completed the movement, Jung intercepted him. Once again, he had hit a vital point. Falling to the ground again, he began to curse that everyone had acted dishonestly. Jung considered his words unworthy of a fighter. Then, he dealt another blow to the bastard. Then, dozens of relentless blows fell upon Asher. In the end, he loudly announced his admission of defeat. Jung, who had stopped, did not really believe his words. When the spearman finished, Juan called Nika next. Soon, both fighters reached the same level. Without further instructions or hesitation, Nika began to beat Asher. Subsequently, one after another, the students practiced their techniques on Asura. At the end of these beatings, the fat man spoke up and announced the amount of gold that Asher was obliged to pay everyone. Asher tried to answer something, but only air came out of his swollen lips. Without really understanding anything, the fat man thought that Asher was refusing to pay. Because of this, the fat man asked Juan for permission to train some more on Asura. Juan agreed, which caused Asher to loudly shout out his approval for payment. Subsequently, the action moved to an elite academy. There, still talking with the tavern keeper, Teacher Lu hoped for Huang's consent. As they were talking, the floorboards nearby creaked. Asher returned, battered and swollen. Teacher Lu didn't even recognize him at first. So, Asura had to convince Lu of this. Seeing the student's condition, Lu wanted to know what had happened to him. Upset, Asher admitted that he had been beaten, adding that it was not Juan, but his disciples. Hearing this was a genuine surprise for Teacher Lu. In order not to look completely insignificant, Asher began to retell how it all happened. After listening, Teacher Lu came to the conclusion that the usual fighting technique was just a deception. Lu understood that even though he knew he was vulnerable, skill still played a significant role. Moreover, now finding Juan not so simple. In any case, Lu had no intention of abandoning his student. Next, he turned to the tavern keeper. As it turned out, he knew the head of the school. Afterwards, they started talking about ways to discredit Juan, but their conversation was suddenly interrupted. It was teacher Lexios, whose visit Lou had not expected at all. Suddenly, he started talking about the Bureau of Education. Lou didn't really understand what the other teacher was getting at. As it turned out, Lexios brought information about Director Shan. By decision of the council, he was fired just a couple of hours ago. Lexios explained that Shauna was caught rigging the test. This news alarmed Lou. But this did not answer the question of who accused the school principal. The tavern keeper insisted that it would not be easy to remove such a person. Lexios began to recall that the catalyst was a certain previously unsuccessful teacher. Asher immediately voiced that they were talking about Juan. Hearing about this again, teacher Lou was confused. In a very short time, Juan managed to do a lot of things. The question arose whether Juan was really the worst of teachers. Following this, the events moved back to Juan's school. He was just finishing his lecture. As he sent the students home, he reminded them that after-school practice should be mandatory. Juan hoped that in the future, his students would not let him down. A little later, his students gathered in the park. With interest, they discussed the development rank of their teacher. Absolutely all of them believed in Juan's powers. But at the same time, we consider it important not to fall flat on our faces. One by one, the disciples agreed with Joe's words. Finally, they unanimously decided to train even harder than before. Meanwhile, Juan was thinking about his students. Some of them have already proven themselves to be excellent from the very beginning. But there were also those over whom Juan had to work hard. Juan saw the fat man as the main problem in his squad. But he had absolutely no idea how to activate his ancestral skills. Juan didn't even notice how he accidentally left the real world. Once again, he found himself in the middle of an astral library. A light breeze blew, and a book flew into his hand. The text in that one spoke about the activation of ancestral skills. Juan took most of the methods calmly until he reached the last one. There, the scripture suggested inflicting mutilations in order to activate the abilities of the ancestral blood. Naturally, the latter did not suit Juan at all. Having decided to try out the first options, Juan went to the Pharmacists Guild. The Alchemists Guild has always been a very lively place. Thousands of people flocked here, especially representatives of the clans. However, not all guild representatives were happy with such a flow of clients, sometimes wishing there were far fewer of them. As luck would have it, one of those people was Juan. He immediately began asking about ways to reveal ancestral skills. Juan explained that he was looking for special books for this need. The girl at the counter was uncompromising, making it clear that the books were not for sale. This was the first time Juan had encountered such resistance. Then, Juan at least hoped to take a look at the library. The girl explained that one could only get into such a place by becoming a member of the guild. This thought intrigued Juan, so he was willing to take the risk. The girl took Juan's words with a certain amount of distrust. Unable to refuse, the girl agreed to take Juan to the wing where the entrance exams were taking place. However, considering that all this was done for the sake of female attention, along the way, warning Juan about the extremely difficult questions on the exam. However, Juan was not at all afraid of this. It was the first time the girl had encountered such an attitude. Once again, he thought that Juan was simply showing off. Soon, both characters arrived at the wing where the exam was being held. The girl sent greetings to her uncle, who was in charge of this place, pointing at Juan along the way. Juan confirmed that he wanted to take the exam to join the guild. The manager nodded and announced the price of the contribution. Juan eagerly reached for his wallet. The girl wasn't particularly impressed that Juan was also rich. After accepting the payment, the manager announced the start time of the exam. Juan wasn't particularly happy to learn how long he would have to wait. Taking advantage of the moment, he asked permission to read books from the library and prepare. The manager approved this decision, pointing to the right door. Juan nodded in response, promising not to get carried away. The girl still believed that Juan was playing some kind of cunning game. Not even a couple of minutes had passed when noise began to be heard inside the library. All this reminded me that Juan was more likely simply leafing through the books than reading them. The manager asked the girl to ignore Juan and mind her own business. She was absolutely sure that Juan would fail the exam. After all, in her opinion, this should have been preceded by a long preparation. Meanwhile, Juan himself finished studying another book. Now he understood why there were so few apothecaries in the world. After all, the material that needed to be studied was truly enormous. When the time came, Juan was ready to take the exam. When he entered the classroom, he found that there were other people sitting there. A minute later, silence reigned in the classroom. A man entered who greeted the future potential pharmacists. He announced the order in which the exam would be conducted. Finally, the exam started. Each participant had a pile of papers placed on their desk. Juan admitted that in his past life, passing exams was much easier for him. The examiner demanded that the participants not hesitate, but start working as soon as possible. Unlike the others, Juan had an ace up his sleeve. The astral library was supposed to help, but here, for some unknown reason, the system prompted Juan about the properties of the paper itself, rather than about the questions on that one. Changing tactics, Juan focused on the questions themselves. A moment later, he found himself inside the astral library. Luckily for him, the information he needed was found there. After which, Juan began to write furiously. The examiner became interested in this. For some reason, he was sure that Juan would not be able to pass the exam, but less than 10 minutes had passed before Juan finished the text part. The examiner did not expect anyone to be able to complete the text section so quickly, but Juan was already waiting for the next stage of the exam. In the end, he was asked to wait outside. The examiner didn't show it, but he considered Juan an upstart, and no one outside expected to meet Juan so early. The girl laughed, thinking that Juan had gotten scared and run away. The returnee did not understand why he had displeased the young lady so much. After some time, the first part of the exam was completed. The examiner began checking the papers. The pharmacist who showed up expected that among the participants, there would be worthy candidates to become students. But the examiner did not radiate joy. At some point, the pharmacist noticed one of the works that was simply lying on the floor. The examiner was in no hurry to touch it, since it was written by Juan. However, the pharmacist became interested in the work. Reading the answers, the pharmacist was amazed. He even asked the examiner to look at those. The examiner accepted the papers without much enthusiasm. But when I started scrolling through it, I was shocked. The more he read, the more amazed he became. It's unclear how, but Juan didn't make a single mistake. The pharmacist confirmed this conclusion. The pharmacist admitted that even he himself could not answer some of the questions. The examiner was somewhat confused by what had happened. At that same time, Juan was dozing. Suddenly, the classroom door opened. An examiner appeared and asked to listen to him. The girl kept glancing sideways at Juan, expecting him to embarrass himself. Then the assistant spoke, naming the people who had passed the exam. The first 3 candidates were named. They were happy about who managed to score how many points. At the end, the assistant called out Juan's name. With a trembling voice, he said that Juan had scored a full 100 points. This is the first time in the history of exams that something like this has happened. The assistant then invited the voiced persons to proceed to the next stage. Actually, Juan was also invited there. The girl was stunned when this happened. Juan stood up and waved his hand. Only now did the girl realize that it was Juan who had passed the exam with 100 points. Now she felt ridiculous because of her previous attitude towards it. In any case, the second stage of the exam has started. From now on, the participants had to correctly identify herbs and also describe their uses. The examiner announced that everyone had very little time for this task. Juan immediately grabbed the first stalk. With knowledge from the astral library, Juan remained cheerful. The examiner could not help but notice that person's behavior. At some point, confusion appeared on Juan's face. After all, the cunning examiner put in a little-known plant for identification. However, Juan's doubts lasted no more than a second. Finally, the examiner became familiar with the completed work. The result surprised him so much that he even introduced it to a pharmacist. It was later announced that only one person had passed the second stage of the exam. Suddenly, pointing to one of the participants, the named young man beamed with happiness. Juan was amazed, because there was no way he could answer incorrectly, and so he openly asked for clarification. Juan's address to the examiner was insolent, even somewhat contemptuous. The expressed indignation made the examiner and the pharmacist exchange glances. After which, Juan received an explanation that he had made a mistake in one formulation. Juan was told that he had an excellent chance of becoming a pharmacist, but next time, not accepting this answer, Juan headed to the table where the grass samples were lying. The examiner explained that Juan had made a mistake in the name of the herb, and there could be no doubt about this. And yet, Juan himself thought completely differently. Unexpectedly, he began to practically accuse the examiner of malicious intent. Juan believed that the examiner had planted a different type of grass, and he didn't really know anything about it. In response, the examiner ordered that a book describing medicinal herbs be delivered. The assistant delivered the book as quickly as possible. The examiner opened the book, noting along the way that Juan was extremely cunning. At some point, the examiner froze. Looking at his reaction, Juan already understood that the examiner had seen where he had made a mistake. Thus, Juan managed to catch the examiner out on the fact of rigging, and also on the lack of some knowledge. To confirm my words, I was ready to conduct a small demonstration using the plant. The pharmacist was extremely interested in Juan's words. Following his advice, he revealed the plant's properties. Later, he became convinced that the examiner's early verdict about Juan was incorrect. The examiner sighed and even gave up on further searches for the truth. And overall, the situation was not very pleasant. It just so happened that those who had already passed the exam were considered losers. The examiner, throwing up his hands, acknowledged that Juan was right, and also the fact that he was now the last participant in the exam. Along the way, the pharmacist gave Juan a special token that allowed him to use the guild's services. Juan thanked him in return, finally feeling like he was getting closer to his true goal. Next, the examiner and the pharmacist began to offer themselves as mentors for Juan. Not daring to take on too much, Juan refused them. The examiner laughed, realizing that Juan needed time to process everything first. The pharmacist supported the examiner, but reminded him that sooner or later, Juan would have to resort to the services of a mentor. A little later, Juan started talking about possible drugs to unlock hereditary abilities. What he said puzzled the pharmacists. Having thought about it, they began to voice that such drugs have always been individual. In this case, Juan would like to read books on the topic of these drugs. The examiner knew about such books, but he simply couldn't lend them to Juan. The pharmacist fully justified his colleague's words. Further, he offered Juan to become his student and then reveal to him the secrets of the books. He tried in every possible way to convince Juan of the advisability of this decision. Juan wasn't very impressed, since so far he had only been recruited and not rewarded in any way. The examiner supported his colleague because Juan simply had no other choice to achieve what he wanted. Ultimately, Juan agreed to become a pharmacist. However, the way Juan wished for this to happen caused a strong reaction from pharmacists. Juan's words cut painfully into the master's self-esteem. After clearing his throat, the examiner began to explain to Juan how difficult and long this path had been. Juan never expected that the process of becoming a pharmacist could be so difficult. Then, Juan wondered whether he would be able to put his plan into practice. By chance, the pharmacists heard his muttering. The examiner laughed, saying that it would take Juan years to become a real healer. Scratching the back of his head, Juan said out loud that he was forced to look for another way. The pharmacist tried to dissuade Juan, declaring that he had no right to lose his knowledge. Juan felt a temporary stupor, because he had received all the knowledge about herbs in literally a matter of hours. Afterwards, he said goodbye to the pharmacists. Almost at the last moment, the examiner stopped Juan. He was forced to acknowledge Juan's outstanding memory, quietly declaring that he was suitable for his colleague. However, another way to become a pharmacist was not so simple. If it had gone wrong, Juan would have experienced major problems with his health and abilities. Ultimately, the pharmacists decided to take a chance. Standing nearby, Juan did not understand what they were whispering about, or why they were behaving so strangely. At some point, the examiner began to voice ways to become a pharmacist. If one consisted of long years of accumulating experience, then the second was associated with pills. It goes without saying that Juan didn't understand anything that was said. Then the examiner started talking about the Grandmaster. The second pharmacist spoke up, explaining how good the Grandmaster was at various things. Further, their speech touched upon the possibility of becoming that very Grandmaster. But this path was extremely difficult. This is precisely why pharmacists started talking about the pill debate. The examiner said that the Grandmaster only discussed and did little. Finally, Juan understood what the two pharmacists were getting at an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge. Juan thought, having an astral library at his disposal, this method would be acceptable. The pharmacist immediately explained that the option with pills was chosen extremely rarely. Juan naturally wanted to know the reasons. He was given to understand that he would have to engage in endless disputes with the masters. Juan thought about it, but was not averse to trying his luck. The examiner continued, saying that many people had taken this path, but only a pitiful handful of those actually achieved success. The examiner blamed everything on the method itself, which had been practically forgotten. With nothing to lose, Juan agreed. The pharmacist's eyes nearly popped out of their heads when he agreed. After all, Juan had no idea about the consequences. Then, they began to explain to Juan the difficulties of the matter. Enormous financial costs and physical punishment were threatened for anyone who failed the discussion. Juan agreed that things were not looking so rosy now. The pharmacist explained that it was precisely because of these punishments that people practically never returned to the method. This is why the path of discussion was considered too risky for Juan. But Juan, for some unknown reason, suddenly expressed a desire to participate in those. In addition, asking respected pharmacists to help with the organization, also hinting at the desire to do everything as quickly as possible. The pharmacists were confused because Juan didn't even know anything about the test questions. Juan saw no problem, already eager to visit the library's basic section. The pharmacists were again stunned, because Juan wanted to achieve everything in a matter of days, while something similar would have taken decades. In response, Juan only asked not to worry about anything. Of course, his words only further panicked the pharmacists. Juan assured that he understood everything perfectly, and only asked for help. The pharmacists were in a state of shock, because in fact, Juan did not know even 1% of the secrets of healing. Ultimately, they decided to grant Juan's request. Juan in turn openly thanked them. After which I was about to leave when I heard a crash. The respected pharmacists lost consciousness and fell to the floor. Later, they discussed how reckless Juan could be. And yet, recognizing how confident he was, they could only hope that Juan himself was as resilient as he pretended to be. In any case, they were comforted by the thought that Juan had gone to the library for knowledge. A couple of minutes later, a technical servant entered the pharmacist's room. He reported that Juan was simply flipping through pages in the library. This news interested the examiner. The servant described in detail exactly which textbooks Juan had taken. Hearing this, the pharmacists looked at each other. They knew that the books listed only contained basic knowledge. So, just in case, they decided to ask the servant again. The servant hesitated, beginning to explain that Juan had, in general, treated books strangely. At some point, it became clear to the pharmacists that Juan was leafing through not just a couple of pages, but entire books from cover to cover. They even suggested that Juan was trying to find some information in this way. Following this, the action moved to a dormitory for students at an educational institution. There, in high spirits, Nika returned to her room. Yao appeared by chance, announcing that he had to leave urgently. He was worried about Nika, hoping that ill-wishers would not get to the girl. Nika herself did not understand what he was talking about, especially if it concerned Juan. Yao was still skeptical about it, and about those around him. At some point, Yao noticed the plant that was in Nika's chest. The girl admitted that she received it from Juan to treat her illness. Yao was confused by this news. Yao explained that such grass was very rare and also cost a lot of money. The girl was embarrassed she had never heard such details before. Then Yao began to explain in detail the special properties of the gifted herb. The story he told was simply incredible. Yao claimed that there was no way he could have been wrong. After hearing everything, Nika's hands began to tremble. Yao also began to sweat, because Juan could never have afforded such expenses. In her mind, Nika practically idolized Juan, because he, without bragging or demands, went for something like this. Then, standing up, the girl said that she could not accept such an expensive gift. So she started talking to Yao about money. Yao reached into his pocket, voicing the amount of 20,000. Next, Nika learned from Yao that Huang was now within the boundaries of the Pharmacists' Guild. Having put all the information together, the girl came to the conclusion that it was there that Juan bought the expensive gift. After which, calling Yao with her, the girl went in search of Juan. An hour later, the action moved to the building of the Pharmacists' Guild. There, the characters learned that Juan had successfully passed the exam. The girl behind the counter announced that Juan could now have the title of assistant. Yao immediately told Nika that Juan had probably spent a lot of money. Besides, Yao wasn't sure that Juan would actually be able to pass such an exam. Overhearing the conversation, the girl behind the counter told how easily Juan had passed the first qualifying stages, also saying that Juan managed to do it without making any mistakes. The more Yao learned about Juan, the less he considered him a famous loser. For Yao, the situation surrounding Huang became more and more mysterious. The girl behind the counter continued her story. She reported that the next stage of the exam would be even more difficult. Just now, 2 participants of the second stage of the exam appeared at the exit. They were immediately asked about the results. Sighing, they announced that they had failed. The girl behind the counter asked about Juan. One of the participants reported that Juan had passed. No one could have expected Juan to pass the exam. Nika ran up and began to wonder when Juan himself would show up. The exam participants reported that Juan had now gone to the library. They shocked everyone again, because according to them, the very next day Juan planned to become a pharmacist. Former participants swore to the truth of their words. Having heard enough, the girl behind the counter recalled that the path Juan had chosen had been extremely difficult. Yao couldn't understand why Huang, who had just become a pharmacist's assistant, was in such a hurry. Former exam participants began to recall some of Juan's overheard speeches, considering that he was in a great hurry to get somewhere. Hearing this, Nika already had some guesses about Juan's plans. After starting to talk about Juan's possible punishment for failure, former exam participants again began to recall some conversations. Nika felt as if she had been electrocuted when she heard about the $1,000,000 gold fine. More and more, Nika became convinced of how selfless a person Juan was. At the same time, Juan himself sighed tiredly. Having studied almost every book possible, he found very little useful information. As he left the library, he was convinced that he would certainly have to become an assistant, immediately bumping into pharmacists who were discussing something among themselves. Having peeked, he realized that they were making some guesses about Juan himself. So, Juan decided to openly talk about the reasons for visiting the library. At the same time, removing all doubts from myself, Juan was immediately informed that the masters would arrive tomorrow for a discussion. The returnee promised to prepare for the arrival of those. Thinking about all sorts of things, Juan moved towards the exit of the guild building, unexpectedly bumping into Nika. Kneeling down, the girl thanked the teacher. Juan also decided to find out if Nika had managed to take the tinctures. Suddenly, Yao knelt down in an expression of sympathy and respect. Juan never expected to receive such honors from him. Still silent, Juan began to talk about the strange meeting. Moreover, recognizing how radically, in a couple of weeks, thanks to actions, the opinion about it has changed, and therefore, asking those who have fallen on their knees to stop. Taking Nika by the hands, Juan began to promise that he would help her in everything. At that moment, an explosion occurred in the depths of the astral library. A certain book was born. In the real world, Yao tried to repay Huang's kindness with money, but the teacher refused, tying everything to his duty. Then Yao began to praise and beg for forgiveness from Huang even more than before. Juan himself turned blue when he heard how much money the stem he got for free at the market actually cost. Yao even suggested that Huang could have paid much more. All this talk about money drove the returnee crazy. Having pulled himself together, Juan pretended that the strata were not a burden to him. The girl behind the counter blushed, now realizing how amazing Juan was. Later, in the dorm, Nika told Yao about her problem. Yao couldn't understand how, with such abilities and knowledge, Huang had such a bad reputation. Then, the girl told Yao about the trust detector. Thus, Yao learned that Huang had conflicts with a number of teachers. He even remembered how he met the school principal's grandson, and Yao didn't like him. Nika only hoped that from now on, Yao would respect Juan. Yao laughed and promised not to be so stupid. And yet, the villainous Shan family haunted Yao. Nika fully supported Yao, asking for his help in the fight against the Shans. Smiling, Yao promised that he would arrange everything. Evening came and the scene moved to Juan's house. The returnee himself sat by the window and enjoyed the night. Moreover, Juan recently completed a meditation, revealing previously unknown vital points in himself. The night passed, a new day arrived, in which Juan was greeted. These were various students who were waiting specifically for Juan. Feng was the first to speak, asking his former teacher for forgiveness. Seeing the young people, Juan now understood why Teacher Lu was so angry with him. In any case, Juan gave the newcomers permission to participate in the lectures. A couple of minutes later, in the classroom, Juan was starting the lesson. Thus began a rather long lecture. The new arrivals did not expect that the secrets of previously unknown combat techniques would be revealed. Hours later, Juan finished his lectures. Moreover, on this day, Juan himself had to conduct serious conversations. For this reason, he headed to the Pharmacists' Guild as quickly as possible. At the entrance, Juan was met by a red-haired woman who announced the arrival of the masters for the discussion. Juan made it clear that he did not refuse to meet with them. In this case, the girl invited Juan to follow her. As he followed her, Juan was actively thinking about how much he needed to do. A couple of minutes later, Juan was led out into a wide hall. The examiner met Juan, advising him to think everything through carefully while there was still time. Juan laughed, explaining that he hadn't had the time to spend long periods of time becoming a pharmacist. The examiner sighed, but accepted Juan's words. After which, he invited the others to enter the hall. Many noble masters appeared on the threshold. One of them was not impressed with Juan, calling him a child. Others even laughed at Juan's arrogance. The examiner stood up for Juan, citing his strengths. The masters were amazed at how many points Juan managed to score on the exam. But even now, some of them had doubts. Basically, all the complaints were based on Juan's extremely young age. And so, Juan interrupted his active discussions with a loud cough, further stating that Juan's knowledge was no worse than anyone else's. Such speeches angered the masters. The examiner nervously tried to calm everyone down. Afterwards, announcing the rules of the discussion. In particular, the disputes that arose were resolved by making a pill. The examiner also reminded the masters themselves that not all questions could be asked. In the end, everything and everyone was clear. The discussion process was about to begin when Juan spoke up. The masters thought that the young man standing in front of them was frightened. Juan denied such claims. Once again, what the returnee said sounded overly insolent. Therefore, Juan apologized as quickly as possible. Then he stated that even the masters themselves would not have passed the discussion. Naturally, the dignity of all those present was offended. Unexpectedly, Juan even suggested increasing the difficulty. The poor examiner didn't even know what to answer. Juan spoke up, proposing a test for the masters themselves, obliging them to make pills. In response to this condition, a hard blow of a fist was heard on the table. One of the masters considered it blasphemous that the work of those masters could be assessed by an assistant pharmacist. Juan believed that they were snapping at him because the masters themselves were afraid. Then, one of the masters stood up from his seat. He decided to be the first to agree to the conditions set by Juan. Then, giving orders to prepare everything necessary, the other masters spoke of the volunteer with admiration. A couple of minutes later, A special oven was installed in the middle of the hall. The master told Juan that if he guessed the pill preparation technique, the returnee would be considered a winner. The examiner clearly understood that no matter how good Juan was, he would not cope. Juan accepted the master's conditions. After this, the master turned to the stove and began to order sleeves. Juan saw how the master was summoning something through the storage ring. A barely audible rustling began to spread throughout the room. Subsequently, the master began to perform manipulations. Even the fire itself reacted and changed to his unknown actions. For the first time, Juan witnessed how alchemy worked. Juan was secretly amazed by the master's technique. However, through the astral library, some shortcomings were revealed to Juan. At the same time, steam burst out of the oven. The device opened and a bunch of pills spilled out. The master had finished his work and now invited Juan. Just in case, Juan asked again about the rules under which he would win. The master announced that he would admit defeat if Juan answered correctly. Juan spread his arms and immediately announced the name of the technique. Hearing this, the master closed his eyes. Juan then began to voice the subtleties. With the help of the astral library, Juan already knew how much foreign knowledge the master had illegally adopted. After which, Juan began to wait for the master to answer. The master began to stutter, and then Juan patted him on the shoulder. Having mastered himself, the master suddenly admitted defeat. Others were surprised at how quickly he gave in. Juan didn't want to waste time, so he invited the next specialist. The sound of a fist hitting the table was heard again, and another master expressed a desire to speak. The new master wanted to teach Juan a lesson and prevent him from humiliating others. None of them had any idea what a dirty secret Juan had unearthed about the first master. The new master was ready to compete, but he also changed the rules themselves. The new master asked Juan not only to name the technique, but also to voice the shortcomings in creating the pills. The new rules finally killed the examiner's faith in Juan's possible victory. Not wanting to waste time, Juan called for the start. The second master was irritated by the boy's excessive self-confidence. As in the first case, the oven was heated. The second master performed the mystery of making pills. He waved his arms and uttered barely audible phrases. Looking at him, Juan already had an idea about the manufacturing technique. At some point, the second master finished his work. Now, as previously agreed, I want to hear from Juan about the shortcomings. Shrugging his shoulders, Juan suggested that the second master prepare himself mentally. Afterwards, we began to talk about everything in order. Juan easily voiced the master's technical shortcomings. It was clear that Juan's words had hurt the second master's pride. Juan grinned and waited to see how the second master would react to everything he had heard. However, the second master was in no hurry to admit defeat, still waiting for words about his technical errors. Juan was prepared for this. Later, we started talking about the oven and the second master's knowledge of this technology. Juan suggested that the master did not differentiate between ovens by efficiency. Juan explained that depending on the approach, the result could be very different. Suddenly, Juan was voicing the oven's specifications down to the smallest detail. Somehow, Juan even managed to determine where and by whom this oven was created. As quietly as possible, the respected masters began to discuss just how important the oven really was. The examiner was also taken aback by Juan's extraordinary knowledge. Having finished talking about the device, Juan put his hand inside the oven. While sorting through the ashes, he started talking about the quality of the fire. Juan stated that temperature played an equally important role in the creation of various types of pills. The second master could barely keep from exploding with rage, because Juan was practically humiliating him. Having stood up, Juan approached the most important thing. Finally, talking about the pills themselves and the precision of the recipe in the manufacture of those. Unexpectedly, Juan began to voice the mistakes of the second master, who used the herb incorrectly. Juan claimed that because of this, the pills that were produced had virtually no healing properties. Juan took the trouble to analyze literally every incorrect use of herbs. Juan practically destroyed the master's reputation, openly believing that the pills turned out much worse than they could have. His loud accusations thundered throughout the entire testing hall. Every now and then, Juan's cries of failure and defeat could be heard from outside the building. The other masters were amazed by Juan's knowledge. Even the volunteer who volunteered could not object to anything. From Juan's speeches, other masters even managed to highlight their own shortcomings. But as for the volunteer, he was completely depressed. After all, today, literally, the collapse of that life happened. The master's shame was so great that his nose even started bleeding. He fell to his knees and surrendered. He even swore that he would never make pills again. The participants in the conversation were disconcerted by what happened. Some of them even felt that they had been overly rude to Juan. The returnee himself was waiting for the next one who would like to compete with him. There was a pause, during which the invited masters exchanged glances. In the end, two masters stood up from their seats at once. However, for some reason they did not want to participate in the previous competition. Instead, they pulled out ordinary pills, whose quality Juan was asked to determine. One of the masters was not particularly pleased that the test had suddenly become easier for Juan. Angry glances were immediately thrown at him. Deciding to smooth things over, Juan agreed to study the pills. The masters willingly passed them on to Juan. As soon as he got the pills in his palm, Juan thought about the shortcomings of those. After a few moments, he announced that the pills were not medicinal, causing either death or serious illness. Confused, the masters asked again. Juan gave answers from afar, explaining the importance of the equinox of the spirit in the creation of medicines, further explaining that both pills were made by people who had mental and physical problems. Juan was not even averse to testing the pills, of course, on experimental animals. Unexpectedly, one of the masters refused to do this. The old master confirmed that he had indeed been having problems with the pills lately. Also, asking your colleague to check the pill. Frightened, he looked at Juan. Juan grabbed him sharply by the shoulder, assuming that the other master was in mental anguish. As always, thanks to the astral library, Juan knew the background of everyone present. He even had the courage to advise the master on how exactly to get rid of the illness. Subsequently, the two masters admitted their defeat. Looking at how easily Juan won, the examiner even thought that they were not testing a young man at all. There were fewer and fewer undefeated masters left, so Juan waited for those. Then, another of the masters rose from his seat. As a result, a verbal altercation accidentally occurred, as the remaining masters began to quarrel over the opportunity to test Juan first. Juan didn't understand why there was any need to quarrel at all. In the end, the examiner said that Juan was extremely cheerful. He also hoped to have a personal conversation with Juan after the debate. Suddenly, someone banged on the table again. One of the masters said that noble people disgrace themselves. Since the others did not dare, or were afraid to test Juan, the bravest of the masters asked to give way to him. Huang recognized Master Liu as the most refined of alchemists. The other masters fell silent. Master Liu slowly walked up to Huang. The master announced that the question would also concern pills. The master briefly mentioned everything that Huang had said earlier. In that case, Master Liu had one question. Unexpectedly, the master began to question Huang about the possibility of collecting information about his daughter's chosen one. But he came to his senses very quickly. The other masters were silent at first. A few seconds later, Master Liu received a lot of negativity from his colleagues due to inappropriate questions. They shamed Master Liu for trying to find a place for his daughter by any means possible. Master Liu grumbled in response, making it clear that all his thoughts were directed towards his daughter. Huan was speechless, as he expected questions about alchemy. In the end, the masters congratulated Huan on his victory. The examiner, with some excitement, awarded him the title of specialist, additionally handing Huan the alchemist's sign itself. Thus, Huan had access to all the guild's services. However, Huan's reward was not very interesting, as the library was secret, soon bringing Huan to a special place. The place was deserted, so the examiner allowed Huan to spend as much time in the library as he wanted. Finally, a true treasure trove of knowledge opened up before the returnee. The examiner left Huan, asking him to contact him if anything happened. As soon as he left, Huan began to warm up. After all, ahead of us, we had to spend a lot of hours studying absolutely all the books. After searching for some time, Huan stopped. They found a story that took place thousands of years ago. Thanks to history, Huan learned about the existence of a certain purity pill. After some searching, I found a tract about a different history. This material greatly interested Huan, since it dealt with blood. At some point, he even transported himself inside the astral library. Upon further reading, Huan learned that the method also did not fully reveal the blood's skills. But by combining methods from both stories at once, Huan hoped to achieve a completely new effect. Later, he left the library. Suddenly, he visited the examiner. Huan decided to openly inquire about the cost of the ingredients he needed. The examiner paused, explaining that most of what Huang had said could be found at the main branch, further stating that it would take at least 10 days to deliver the ingredients. Having no other choice, Huan agreed to wait. Afterwards, we started talking about the price tag. The examiner began counting, ultimately naming the sum as much as 23 million. Not expecting such a price, Huan felt pain in his heart and grimaced. At some point, Huan even considered asking his students for financial help. Soon realizing that he had no right to fall flat on his face, Huan decided to cheat. He even tried to convince the examiner to give him money later. It goes without saying that they refused to lend Huan such expensive ingredients. And yet, the examiner saw a way out for Huan in the form of creating and selling pills. But even in that case, Huan would have had to save money for more than 2 months. The returnee did not have that much time at his disposal. Having thought about it, the examiner saw Huan becoming a grandmaster as the only similar option. Nodding his head, Juan promised that he would pay for the ingredients by the time the technicians arrived. After quickly saying goodbye, Juan ran off to do his business. Then the scene moved to the market. A man approached the seller there. The man who was mistaken for the Grandmaster turned out to be Juan in disguise. Trying to get used to the role, Juan said he wanted to rent a mansion. The merchant was ready to serve such a noble gentleman. The Grandmaster informed him of his preferences in housing. The merchant came closer, quietly whispering that he knew of an excellent but expensive option. The Grandmaster agreed to take a look, although he noted that price was the most important thing. Soon, the merchant led the Grandmaster to an empty mansion. Opening the doors of the mansion, the merchant told about it. Meanwhile, Juan decided to find out everything himself using a proven method. In a short time, the Astral Library revealed the pros and cons of the place. At the end of the presentation, the merchant quoted a rental price of 100,000 gold. With a certain amount of indignation, the Grandmaster repeated this price. The merchant assured that the price was low because the mansion itself exuded luxury. After hearing this, the Grandmaster suddenly jumped up from his seat. In the blink of an eye, being face to face with the merchant jumped back, frightened. The Grandmaster tried to attribute his behavior to the fact that he was testing the merchant. Even though the merchant was weaker in strength, he was no less competitive in price. Then, unexpectedly, the Grandmaster began to voice the sad history of this mansion. The merchant did not understand how anyone could find out so many details. The Grandmaster continued, even voicing the deal that connected the merchant with the mansion. A shudder ran through the merchant. The Grandmaster said he simply wanted to rent a house at a fair price. Soon, an extremely favorable contract was concluded in terms of payment and even maintenance of the house. The Grandmaster promised to generously reward the merchant if he worked well at the house. Although Juan pretended to be a generous gentleman, in reality, he had a very hard time parting with his money. He consoled himself with the fact that he had spent so much for a higher purpose. After counting the money, the merchant agreed to be the Grandmaster's servant. The Grandmaster praised the merchant for making the right choice. Patting himself, he promised to serve faithfully and truly. Additionally, he stated his name, which sounded like Liquid. Having learned the name, the Grandmaster already had an assignment for the servant. One after another, they began to give instructions. The merchant gasped when he realized that the Grandmaster himself was standing in front of him. Juan noted that the most important thing would be to spread the news of his residence in the mansion. Additionally, for good service, they even promised to raise Liquid's rank. From now on, in the eyes of the merchant, the Grandmaster looked like a man sent from heaven. So, he hastened to promise to fulfill everything in the best possible way. Next, Liquid hastened to carry everything out. Juan himself could finally breathe freely. A little later, in his true form, he returned to school. The assembled disciples called out to him. Io handed over to the teacher the list of participants in the competition from Lu. Having studied the list, Juan already saw that Lu had sent far from the best of his students. And yet, Juan sensed something fishy in his gut. Io also decided to speak out about the list of opponents. He believed that the forces were unequal. Io claimed that everything was set up in such a way that in a one-on-one fight, Juan's students would lose. Other students also began to express their concerns. Moreover, some of the students on the list had never been defeated before. All this meant that, even though he was pretending to fight fairly, Lu was trying to cheat. Showing irritation, Juan clenched the list in his fist. Juan was forced to admit that Lu was a worthy opponent in terms of intrigue. Mentally, he began to analyze the capabilities of his students. Some were strong in themselves, while others were just gaining strength. Even to defeat the spearman Jen, Lu managed to find a more skilled fighter. The opponent of the insignificant fat man, who was known as an aggressive fighter, was extremely surprising. Juan felt new worries fall upon him. Filled with rage, Juan threw the list on the ground with all his might. From now on, Juan was doubly determined to carry out all his plans. Some time passed since then, and Juan again took on the appearance of a Grandmaster. Under this guise, Juan returned to his mansion. Inside, he was greeted respectfully by hired servants. Liquid boasted that he had found the best people. He went on to say that the rumor about the Grandmaster's arrival had been spread. Juan was interested in how exactly Liquid had accomplished this. Liquid told a simply incredible story, consisting of self-sacrifice, stupidity, and lies. Moreover, Liquid boasted that he was able to save a lot of money just by using the Grandmaster's name. With each passing second, Juan liked the Grandmaster's guise more and more, subsequently giving orders to prepare tea. Soon the mansion was bustling with life. Liquid would come to the Grandmaster every now and then for advice. Hours passed like this, and Juan was forced to admit that no one would show up. The Grandmaster also gave orders to the guards in case of his absence. Being alone with Liquid, he decided to find out who was the richest in the city. Liquid, without thinking, named a certain lord. Upon hearing this, Juan immediately understood who would be the victim, naturally wanting Liquid to accompany this. Soon, Juan was brought to the building of a trading company. Now Juan knew exactly where the city's richest people lived. Along the way, Liquid introduced his master to the sights. Juan even regretted that he was not so rich. However, for some reason Juan was in no hurry to meet the Lord. Instead, lightly touching the lion statue, grinning and saying that he would like to take a look around. And yet Liquid wanted to know about his master's strange decision. Liquid was careful to choose his words. With permission, he openly did not understand why the Grandmaster did not seek a quick meeting with the Lord. Then, the Grandmaster made it clear that he wanted to force the Lord to take the first step towards the meeting. Liquid considered such a plan to be difficult to implement, claiming that the Lord was too busy for other things. Thinking quite differently, the Grandmaster laughed, further ordering Liquid to do everything that is said. To obtain consent, the Grandmaster ordered the head of the lion statue to be removed. It goes without saying that Liquid was shocked by this order. Falling to his knees, Liquid began to beg for mercy. The Grandmaster believed that Liquid was trying to challenge the order. He insisted on the implementation of what had been previously announced. In the end, Liquid was forced to obey. Hoping for protection from the Grandmaster, he took the sledgehammer into his hands. Then he squeezed it tighter in his palms. At some point, he knocked the head off the statue with all his might. With a huge noise, she fell to the ground. The servants reacted to this event with lightning speed. As quickly as possible, they tried to capture Liquid. In just a split second, the situation escalated to the limit. Even Juan was surprised by this reaction. Seeing Liquid being kicked around, he decided not to interfere. At some point in time, the Lord himself appeared. They explained to Tom what was happening. Bending over the beaten man, the Lord wanted to know the reasons for what had been done. With the last of his strength, Liquid told about his master's order. Afterwards, he pointed towards the Grandmaster. The Lord headed towards that. Coming up, the Lord again inquired about the essence of what had been done. In response, the Grandmaster offered to sit down. Dissatisfied, the Lord sat down opposite. But to all my questions, I only heard tea pouring into the cup. Afterwards, the Grandmaster drank from it, loudly putting the glass down on the table. The Lord's patience was rapidly diminishing. Liquid approached and introduced that very Lord to the Grandmaster. Pretending to remember, the Grandmaster asked about the Lord's family. This made the Lord become aggressive and break a piece of the table. Liquid had no idea what the Grandmaster was guided by. With impatience already in his voice, the Lord wanted to know what the stranger was getting at. Then the stranger repeated his question more politely. The Lord gave a rude answer to the Grandmaster's question. The Grandmaster chuckled, hinting that he could save the life of a man dear to the Lord. The Grandmaster did not back down from his words, even though much of it sounded mysterious. Next, we spoke about jade and its destructive properties. Having finished, Juan stood up and called the servant to follow him. Suddenly, the Lord asked the stranger to stop. The Lord acknowledged the stranger's words, and also guessed that it was because of jade that his loved one was ill. Stopping, the Grandmaster called the Lord's wife an ordinary person. It came as a surprise to the Lord that the stranger knew so much about it. In response, Juan merely recited the symptoms that nephritis caused. Juan called his actions regarding the statue a simple rescue. Afterwards, Juan practically forced the Lord to find a meeting with him himself. The Lord became genuinely interested in the stranger. Without stopping him, he ordered that an appraiser be brought in. A couple of minutes later, he was brought in. Pointing to the stone, the Lord demanded that the appraiser identify it. Coming closer, the appraiser recalled how he had once examined the stone a long time ago. Suddenly, the appraiser shuddered. The Lord clearly saw changes in his behavior. The appraiser confirmed that the lion was made of blood jade. The Lord was not angry, because he understood that the true material was hidden. After some time of observation, the Lord performed the movement. Instantly, it destroyed the rest of the statue. Tiny fragments were scattered throughout the area. The Lord believed that even the maker of the statue himself was most likely unaware of this. The appraiser spoke up, admitting that he had never seen bloody jade with his own eyes before. Then, the Lord returned to the identity of the unknown. The servant said that of the two who came, only Liquid knew, further hesitantly stating that he served the Grandmaster. This news shocked the Lord. It turned out that the Lord was unable to get along with the Grandmaster himself. Having come to his senses, the Lord ordered that as much as possible be learned about the Grandmaster. Meanwhile, Juan and Liquid walked quietly in the middle of the streets. Stroking the places of the beatings, Liquid could not understand why all this was done. But on the entire journey to the mansion, I never received an answer. As he prepared for bed, the Grandmaster ordered that the guards not let anyone through. Not a minute had passed before Liquid was called out, because someone was looking for him. The guard revealed that the servant was being sought by none other than the Lord himself. Liquid was frightened, thinking that the Lord had come for compensation. Not wanting to receive further blows, he ordered the Lord to be let in. Then, in an instant, he cancelled his order, remembering the Grandmaster's own instructions. With pain in his body, he began to think about what would be the best thing to do, ultimately deciding to meet the Lord in person. Subsequently, personally opening the gates of the mansion, the Lord asked Liquid to convey a request for a meeting with the Lord of that one. The servant was amazed, because for the first time the Lord was so polite. This attitude even made Liquid burst out laughing. And yet he refused the Lord the right of entry. The Lord himself was shocked by the news that the Grandmaster was already resting. In the depths of my soul, I realized that I had simply angered him. In an attempt to smooth over an earlier misunderstanding, he gave Liquid the medicine. At the same time, asking to hand over some papers to the Grandmaster. Liquid accepted such expensive things with bated breath, immediately remembering that he was a servant of a nobleman. This means that Liquid could not accept these gifts in the form of bribes. So, asking the Lord to visit the Grandmaster tomorrow. The Lord didn't even know how to comment on this. Unexpectedly, an appraiser began to ask for the Lord. In any case, Liquid was impregnable. As he left, he ordered the gates to be closed. They closed almost in front of the Lord's nose. The Lord sighed, admitting that he himself was to blame for everything. The situation was not the best for that. For now, the Lord could only accept the terms of someone else's game. Liquid, shaking in panic, secretly eavesdropped on all this. He couldn't believe that he had actually communicated with a noble person in such a way. Afterwards, he hurried to inform the Grandmaster about everything. Soon, appearing before his master, Liquid boasted that he had carried out the previous instructions exactly. The Grandmaster praised him dryly. Juan stopped drinking his tea, noting to himself that his plan was working. The night passed, and a new day began. Liquid greeted his master, who had just woken up. He said that the Lord had been waiting outside the gate all night. Juan was surprised by this news. But first, I still wanted to eat. Once again, Liquid was amazed by the Grandmaster's manners. Around the same time, someone whistled. Whistling a tune, he walked briskly past the mansion. Noticing the Lord standing there, he did not understand who could not let such a noble person in. So, he became interested in the situation. Some of his servants told him about the rumors. The whistler was shocked by what he heard. Afterwards, he began to look sideways at the Lord in a strange way. At some point, the gates of the mansion opened. Their eyes widened when Liquid appeared on the porch. He spoke with the Lord, inviting him inside. In response, the Lord sincerely thanked for the hospitality, at the same time, giving him money. This scene completely shocked the whistler. Later, the action moved to the courtyard of the mansion. There, the Lord apologized for his recent behavior. The Grandmaster replied that he held no grudge. However, the Grandmaster was interested in the idea of why the Lord was left outside the gates. The Lord laughed awkwardly, even though he knew the answer. Moreover, the Grandmaster called the time spent by the Lord a good one. Naturally, the Lord asked again about this. Next, the Grandmaster spoke about the Lord's wife. The Lord confirmed that she was seriously ill. The Grandmaster concluded that the Lord was in no hurry to go home due to fear of causing harm. The Lord gasped, unaware that he was a danger to his loved ones. Liquid was delighted with his master's commitment. Moreover, the Lord himself rose to his knees and began to thank. The Grandmaster accepted his words, asking to bring the Lord's wife. The Lord promised to do it as soon as possible. The Grandmaster then turned his attention to Liquid. He was worried, not being sure that he was ready for the rank change. Standing up from his seat, the Grandmaster asked him not to worry in vain. He even explained what exactly the fear of Liquid's transition lies in. In a mournful voice, the Grandmaster began to explain how exactly he would carry out the transition. He convinced Liquid that beating him was necessary. Moreover, somehow the Grandmaster guessed about the medicine Liquid had received. Liquid himself did not expect that his master would be so insightful. The Grandmaster did not scold him, not seeing anything bad in the gifts. Further, demanding that Liquid demonstrate his strike. Moreover, the Grandmaster wanted to see everything as soon as possible. But at some point the servant became very worried. Meanwhile, not wanting to anger the Grandmaster, in that case, the Grandmaster wanted what had been said to be observed. Liquid settled down on the floor, and Juan began to prepare something. At the opportune moment, Juan took out the needle. Just one poke of the needle and Liquid's rank began to progress. Liquid immediately felt a change in himself. No more than a couple of minutes passed, and his strength increased. Liquid's joy knew no bounds. Having finished riding, he began to thank his master. Having asked him to calm down, the Grandmaster sent him to meet the Lord. At the same time, on the street, the Whistler was looking at the mansion. A minute later, the Lord came out from there with a quick step. The Whistler was amazed at how much the Lord was in a hurry. Having decided to find out everything, he handed the cage to his servant. At that very moment, Liquid appeared on the porch. The characters' gazes crossed. Mr. Dimitri, whom Liquid recognized, was interested in the servant's fate. Liquid boasted that he had found a generous owner. This was the first time Mr. Dimmitt had heard of anything like this. Then, Liquid named his master's Grandmaster status. Mr. Demetre was pleasantly shocked. He saw the Grandmaster as his father's salvation. In a whisper, Liquid explained that the Grandmaster didn't like unnecessary attention. As they chatted, the sound of horses' hooves could be heard. The cart stopped very close to the mansion. Then the Lord himself returned. Under his sensitive guidance, a stretcher was taken out of the carriage. Mr. Demeter was not sure that they would be able to help the Lord's wife. But be that as it may, it was delivered to the Grandmaster. Juan was somewhat confused by the patient's condition. He didn't expect the situation to be so critical. The Lord spoke, wanting to hear at least something from the Grandmaster. Not wanting to lose face, Juan decided to study it. He then began to walk in circles, hoping for help from the astral library. At some point, the Grandmaster found the answer. After which, the Grandmaster asked the Lord for help. He suddenly expressed a desire to touch his wife. The Lord was discouraged, so the Grandmaster did not wait for his permission. Such desires regarding other people's wives infuriated the Lord. But before he could get indignant, everything had already happened. The Lord exhaled, because the Grandmaster had not done anything immoral. Even Liquid was filled with excitement at one point. At some point, the Grandmaster's face began to radiate hope. After all, previously, the Astral Library always found the answer. So this time the required book was found. Reading into it, many things were revealed to Juan. He even managed to read about how to cure the Lord's wife. Afterwards, the Grandmaster carefully placed the woman's hand back in place. The Grandmaster stood up and started talking about the illness. Having bowed, the Lord asked to save his wife. The Grandmaster wanted to help, but he had one problem. The Lord was ready to satisfy any of his desires. In that case, the Grandmaster started talking about long-term treatment. The Lord was ready to fork out immediately. The Grandmaster calmed the Lord, preparing him for the initial procedure. Snatching up a needle, he brought it to the top of the Lord's wife's head. Just one touch, and she made a sound for the first time. Then she opened her eyes and stood up. Juan himself was saddened, because everything happened too quickly. Meanwhile, the wife and husband were finally able to talk. The Lord even introduced the Grandmaster to his wife. Juan sent them away, promising to inform them about future treatment. Additionally, asking Liquid to carry out tech. The happily reunited couple left the Grandmaster's chambers. Juan himself was almost in tears, because he had not managed to strike it rich. Later, Liquid returned to him upset. Liquid admired the Grandmaster's efforts. However, Juan was in no mood to listen to flattery. Following this, Liquid told of a monetary gift from the Lord. Juan could hardly restrain himself from taking those. Later, the events moved to the Duo family mansion. Now Father Demetre was actively spending his time there, every now and then demonstrating his senile whims. In fact, he was acutely worried about the status and fate of his family in the event of his death. At some point, Demeter appeared, calling out to his father. The old man wasn't particularly happy about the visit. However, he asked his son to stay. Then Demeter told about the Grandmaster who had appeared in the city. The old man became interested in the news and even asked his son to repeat it. Many years later, there was no trace of him. As it turned out, the old man was already at the gate, urging his son to hurry to the Grandmaster. Soon, news of the Grandmaster and his abilities spread throughout the city. Juan was impressed that his fame was spreading so quickly. Suddenly, he ordered Liquid to lie down. The servant became frightened, thinking that the Grandmaster would rape him. The Grandmaster's patience was running out. He insisted on carrying out his order. A minute later, the Grandmaster was feeling Liquid and was surprised. Juan muttered out loud that there was no reaction. Afterwards, he asked Liquid not to move at all. Liquid was even more frightened than before, because the Grandmaster wanted to temporarily knock him unconscious. A second later, the Grandmaster hit him on the forehead with the edge of his palm. Thus, Juan learned that only unconscious people could be read by the library. At the same time, another servant appeared, informing the Grandmaster of the arrival of a nobleman. Since Juan had finished his research, he now deliberately woke up Liquid. Lokar, Demetre's father, was invited to the mansion and actively discussed the appearance of the Grandmaster in the city. Being an experienced man, Lokar had many doubts about the identity of the suddenly appeared Grandmaster. Demeter reassured his father, as he had personally witnessed the miraculous recovery of the Lord's wife. After hearing this, Lokar decided to take a risk, since he had nothing to lose in any case. Liquid soon appeared, inviting visitors inside. Lokar looked around actively, becoming increasingly suspicious of the Grandmaster. Soon, he and his son were introduced to the Grandmaster. With just one glance, Lokar saw something amiss in the Grandmaster's appearance. The old man was sure that the Grandmaster was disguising his appearance and was most likely a deceiver. In response, Juan glanced at the old man, who was unpleasantly taken aback by the close attention being paid to him. Suddenly, Demetre spoke up and began to explain that his father was seriously ill. Determined to maintain his image, Juan asked dismissively if he was a healer. Demeter fell silent, realizing that he had started the conversation in the wrong way. Lokar spoke next, explaining that he wanted to talk to the Grandmaster. Juan did not show his shock as the old man began to talk about fighting style. Lokar acted prudently, trying to expose the deceiver. But with the astral library at his disposal, Juan simply could not lose to him. Next, Lokar started talking about a recently learned fighting style that he asked for help in understanding. After which, he began to demonstrate that. Juan tensed, already recognizing the shortcomings of the technique. Not a minute had passed before Juan was already starting a conversation about technical problems. In detail, he described the mistakes that Lokar made. Moreover, being sure that the old man was not human at all. His last words created quite a stir. Immediately, Demeter stood up to defend his father. Juan chuckled, suggesting that the young master direct all claims to Lokar. Demeter looked questioningly at his father. And then, Lokar fell to his knees. Having bowed, the old man sincerely begged for help. Liquid, standing in the passage, was amazed by this scene. It was now that the Grandmaster asked his servant to escort the guests. Nodding, Liquid began to try to expel the nobleman from the Grandmaster's chambers. Lokar tried in every way to stay and even apologized for his previous behavior. Following the Grandmaster's further orders, he was taken out by the arms. Already outside the Grandmaster's domain, the old man humbly knelt down. Lokar told his son to join him, because he now believed in Juan as a true Grandmaster. Demeter tried to get answers from his father, but only ran into a wall of reproaches and demands. After all, Lokar was sure that only the Grandmaster could help him. Obeying, Demeter slowly rose to his knees. Meanwhile, Liquid completely did not understand the Grandmaster's behavior, and how he always managed to achieve what he wanted. Returning to the Grandmaster, he told him about the gentlemen who were now sitting behind the gate. After wanting to know what the owner will do now, Juan held his head, because his plans for enrichment had once again been thwarted. At some point, Juan got up and decided to go somewhere. Before leaving, he is ready to give Liquid one task. Coming closer, he began to whisper something in the servant's ear. Having finished, he expressed his hopes for Liquid. Meanwhile, outside, Lokar explained to his son that he had no other options. At some point, by chance, Lokar overheard the servants talking about the Lord's generous reward for the Grandmaster. These and subsequent speeches greatly interested Lokar, after which he ordered his son to return home and take all his savings from there. The servants continued to chat among themselves, voicing rumors surrounding the Grandmaster. This, in turn, prompted Lokar to add to the list of things that Demeter needed to take with him. But whenever Demetre had to leave, Lokar stopped him, as he heard more and more new information. Everything he heard forced the old man to voice the idea of selling all his property. After all, according to rumors, appeasing the Grandmaster was no easy task. Therefore, Lokar insisted on the fulfillment of all his previous orders. Time passed and the day went on. A rather tired Juan finally took off his Grandmaster mask. Finally, he could breathe freely and, in general, relax. So, in his free time, he went to the Pharmacist's Guild. There, the first batch of ordered goods was already waiting for him. Juan took some of the goods, while also asking about some pills. Having received everything he needed, he started talking about books that would explain spear handling techniques. The examiner became thoughtful, remembering one man who was a master of spear fighting. Juan was delighted, wanting to meet him. The examiner warned that the specialist was not an easy person. And yet, being his friend, the examiner was ready to help Juan. So, both characters went to another part of the city. At the right place, they were met by the specialist's servant. They were asked to wait, and then the examiner began to talk about a specialist named Chuck. The examiner stated that even the Emperor personally noted his merits. At some point, Chuck himself showed up. The examiner and Chuck went to meet each other, being glad of this meeting. At some point, Chuck noticed Juan, thinking that he was the examiner's younger son. After which he introduced Juan. Chuck was pleasantly surprised that such a young man was already an alchemist. The examiner continued to praise Juan, even mentioning the excellent discussion he had had about the pills. Chuck was excited by the young man's results. Afterwards, having sat down, the examiner began to talk about the purpose of the visit. He began to ask Chuka to teach Juan a couple of lessons in spearmanship. Juan coughed, but was forced to lie about his passion for spears, and yet he made it clear that he had never held a spear before. His interlocutors were amazed by what they heard. Juan tried to explain that he had a student who was engaged in spear fighting. Chuck cooled towards Juan, deciding that he was joking or simply wasting other people's time. So he informed that he would hardly be able to help Juan. Juan nodded his head, hinting at the training books. Taking a deep breath, Chuck agreed to introduce Juan to the books. The returnee sincerely thanked the specialist. Later, Chuck took Juan to his library. Afterwards, he left Juan alone with the books. Juan himself smiled, as he had achieved his goal. A little later, from afar, one could hear how actively Juan was turning the pages of books. He admitted that Chuck's library was truly impressive. While Juan was looking for the necessary information, the examiner and Chuck settled down to drink tea. Among themselves, they actively discussed Juan's talents. Subsequently, their conversation turned to the difficulties of mastering the spear. Chuck chuckled, hinting that everything most important was kept in his head. It was for this reason that he was not against letting Juan into his library. Chuck believed that Juan was simply overestimating himself, and therefore, he was obliged to leave the library soon. The examiner agreed with this, hoping that Juan would return to alchemy. It was then that his eyes suddenly became focused on the threat. Jumping up from his place, he rushed to save his friend. After all, now, some kind of furious force was moving towards them. Chuck noticed her in time and took a defensive stance. By thrusting out his spear, he managed to cut through the furious force. Losing concentration, she walked past and crashed into the wall behind her, leaving a rather impressive hole at the point of impact. Chuck was sure that a spiritual spear had been launched in their direction. Chuck expressed caution, since only professionals possess such technology, and the one who attacked the people peacefully drinking tea, in his opinion, was clearly nearby. As expected, the culprit behind this force was Juan. Without expecting it, he somehow activated the technique. Other people ran to the place from which the spiritual spear was launched. There they met Juan. Frightened, Juan announced that he would definitely compensate for the damage. Afterwards, they started talking about the technique Juan had used. Juan didn't know the name, so he showed Chuku what he had learned. Chuck recoiled, as Juan could perform high-ranking techniques without ever wielding a spear. The examiner was completely at a loss to understand that Juan had managed to achieve such a thing in half an hour. In any case, their awkward conversation continued. Chuckling, Juan placed the knowledge of what he had done on Chuck's books. Hearing this, Chuck almost cried, because he had spent almost his entire life mastering the spear. The examiner tried to calm him down, blaming everything on Juan's incredible talent. Nevertheless, Juan wanted to learn more from Chuka about the spiritual spear. Then Chuck began to reveal this issue in detail. After listening to him, Juan was convinced that he would pass on this knowledge to his student. Next, asking for a couple more tips on techniques from books. Feeling discomfort and envy, Chuck agreed. Then he handed Juan the spear and asked him to demonstrate. After a couple of minutes, they took positions opposite each other. At some point, Juan made the first move. With his spear thrust forward, he advanced on Chuck, his zeal reminiscent of a tiger. Seeing this, Chuck's eyes widened, but he could no longer resist in any way. A great power rushed through him. The tip of the spear stopped a couple of centimeters from Chuck's head. Juan praised Chuck, because he withstood such a technique and did not even flinch. But Chuck himself experienced completely different emotions. Juan spoke again, wishing to teach these techniques to his student. Chuck wasn't against it, but he couldn't give Juan any advice either, since he was clearly superior to the pro. Juan was overjoyed that he had succeeded in this matter. Meanwhile, Chuck was breathing heavily, thinking about everything that had just happened. At some point, he even asked Juan to teach him. Juan happily agreed. Afterwards, they both muttered about something for a long time. After the conversation, Chuck was speechless. Besides, he now wanted to thank Juan. The examiner intervened and began to hint to Chuku about paying for some order of Juan's. Nodding approvingly, Chuck handed Juan a large sum of money. Juan was shocked by the sheer brutality of the situation, as he himself had become a teacher and even earned money. So, of course, he accepted the payment. Juan then turned to the examiner, asking him to hold back the pills. After all, the returnee at this moment had to return to school as quickly as possible. Walking back, Juan chuckled, because finally his plan was getting closer to being realized. Thus he reached the gates of his school. Opening those, the first person he met was Lita. Unexpectedly, the conversation between them turned to the location of the other students. The girl's voice trembled because there were no other students in school at the moment. But then, a fat man burst into the school, calling Lita to some kind of battle. He was in such a hurry that at first he didn't even see Juan. Juan was very interested in the fat man's words about a certain battle. Juan felt intolerant because he was openly disobeyed. After all, instead of training, the students were doing who knows what. The fat man began to explain that the fight broke out because of Juan, whose honor the students stood up to defend. What he heard outraged the returnee. In some part of the educational institution, passions were truly running high right now. Zheng was vocal in defending Huang's reputation. Shan ridiculed those words. Shang voiced Huang's poor skills, blaming the students for making bad choices. They actively disagreed with him, citing the investigation as an example, which proved slander against Juan. Shan brushed it off, saying the decision to deny funding had already been made. His manners angered Nika. Shan continued to incite her to do something rash. Yet Shang was willing to reward Huang's students for their audacity, but only if they defeated his pupils. So, Shan invited dissenters into the arena. Io spoke up and said the challenge must be accepted. Jung agreed that Huang had done a lot for his students without any selfish motive. Unanimously, they decided to take part in the brawl. Nika's eyes burned brighter than anyone else's, and she was ready to tear anyone apart for Teacher Huan. Sheng made it clear that Shang's proposal was accepted. Shan warned so that the children would not regret their choice. After which, he invited everyone who wanted to watch the battle. Then he presented a horde of his students, who were to be defeated. And this number was quite large. In the end, Jung decided to enter the arena first, since the others were still injured. It was precisely this situation that was told to Huan. Huan knew that the man who started the brawl only resembled Shang, but was not him. In fact, he called him Valen, and he himself had previously been a student. At the same time, the battle thundered in the arena. Although exhausted and wounded, Jung fought with all his might. They laughed at this, because there were only 6 defeated opponents, and Jung was already at his limit. So now Jung was going to be taken out of the game. The student closed his eyes, realizing that he would no longer be able to repel this attack. But the blow did not happen, because Huan intervened in the situation. Immediately, such intervention was considered unworthy. In response, Huan asked whether it was worth it for him to beat up other people's students. With one movement, he completely broke the training staff. Valen began to reproach Huan because he was breaking every possible rule. But he was ready to forget about everything if Huan recognized the weakness of his students. Hearing this, Jung snapped at the other teacher. Without waiting for Huan's answer, he refused to accept any defeat. Unexpectedly, Huan supported him in everything. In that case, Valen demanded that the battle continue. Huan laughed, getting the point across that he wouldn't let his students lose. Valen ignored his words, calling for Huan to leave the arena. In response, Huan started talking about respect for his students, and therefore, he considered the current arena unsuitable for those. Everyone immediately guessed that they were talking about a more serious place. Valen understood these words as a challenge to Huan's students. Taking the initiative, Huan asked if Valen was scared. Laughing out loud, he of course agreed. Afterwards, setting important conditions for the winners and losers, Huan readily agreed to these conditions. Nika was worried, because even having become stronger, she did not hope to defeat another teacher. Finally, the question was raised regarding the details of the battle. Scratching his head, Huan spoke about the one-on-one battle. Moreover, he sent Jung to finish what he started. Valen was furious at Huan's self-confidence. Patting Jung on the shoulder, Huang explained to the boy exactly how the fight should be conducted. True, before, Huang wanted to teach Jung one technique. Huan assured that this technique would easily allow him to defeat Valen. So, immediately, he began to show Jung something. Huan asked to be attentive and remember everything. The next moment, he began to twirl his staff, making funny sounds. Seeing this, Valen was not at all impressed. After finishing the demonstration, Huang put his trust in Jung. Jung thanked the teacher, even though he had known this simple movement since he was 5 years old. Then, going behind the boy's back, Huan secretly, but in a special way, patted him on the back. Jung immediately felt some new power flowing into him. Before they had gone far, Huang whispered to Jung to calm down. He promised that with his spiritual strength, he would help the spearman defeat another teacher. In this simple way, Jung discovered a previously unknown combat mechanic within himself. Now, he acted strictly according to Huan's instructions. Valen even ridiculed the spearman, believing that he would not be able to resist. However, the boy was ready for the fight. Hearing this, Valen angrily clenched his fists and bared his teeth. In full view of everyone, Valen was ready to humiliate Huan and teach his student a lesson. During the wait before the fight, Huang even refused to let Nika replace Jung. After all, only Huan knew about the little secret in this battle. Moreover, Jung had no intention of holding back. Valen responded similarly. Their attacks were about to intersect. At the right moment, Jung used the fighting technique he had acquired, after which he performed a lunge with a spear. A spiritual snake burst from the tip of the spear, and with its mouth open, flew towards Valen. After which, dozens of bites and pokes fell upon him. While suffering defeat, Valen even managed to curse Huan. In the end, he was defeated. Exhausted, he fell down not far from his students. They looked sadly at their teacher, whom they had managed to defeat. On the other hand, Jung's merits in the victory were noted. Jung himself addressed Valen, who was being lifted from the ground. The spearman reminded of the importance of adhering to the previously announced conditions. Reluctantly, Valen gave his students orders. He even barked at those who doubted the teacher's decision. Afterwards, Jung showed off the pills he had received as a reward. But Valen knew that this win was not honorable, since it was Huan's student who won, not Huan himself. Taking the box, Huan looked at the pills he had received. Huan couldn't believe it was all about those damn pills. After which, he crushed them with all his might. Valen almost lost consciousness from the sight of what happened. Huan himself began to explain that such pills did more harm than good. Besides, Huan had something more worthwhile for his students, giving them special pills that were non-addictive. At the same time, Huan made it clear that his students should no longer participate in such trivial fights. Later, he began to distribute special means to each student for healing and support. With his head bowed, Valen listened to how Bravura Huan praised and rewarded his students. At some point, his wounded pride couldn't take it anymore. Finally, he led the students back to school. Later, Nika was confused about the cost of the gift. Squeezing the girl's shoulders tightly, Huan only demanded that she help him win in the future in exchange for payment. All the other students readily agreed to fulfill this request. Huang praised everyone for their spirit, but wanted to talk to Zheng separately. Having asked him to go into a separate room, Huan started talking about a new technique. First of all, asking the spearmen not to expand on this topic. Moreover, Zheng was still deeply impressed by the reception. Huang hoped that Zheng would master the knowledge he had acquired. As for the name of the fighting technique, Huang left this right to Zhen. He soon returned to the rest of the students, reminding them of the principles of teaching and discipline. At the same time, passions were running high in the city regarding the Grandmaster. Lokar and his son, as before, were waiting for the opportunity to see him. At some point, Liquid appeared, announcing that they were ready to receive them. Secretly from the side, someone was watching this scene. Once inside the mansion, Lokar began to ask for forgiveness. He fell on his knees and sincerely repented. The Grandmaster stopped his whining, as he had already made the decision to help. Then, Lokar confirmed the words once spoken by the Grandmaster. Later, the Grandmaster guessed how exactly Lokar managed to become a beast. The Grandmaster knew that because of the wolf's blood that Lokar consumed, he became possessed every afternoon. Lokar obediently agreed with everything he heard. Demetra now understood why his father had been behaving strangely in recent years. The Grandmaster even specified how much power Lokar received when he became a werewolf. And yet the Grandmaster called what Lokar had done a mistake. Lokar again agreed with everything, now hoping for salvation. Then the Grandmaster put the mug of tea aside. Lokar was surprised when the Grandmaster announced that there was a chance to be cured with wolf blood. The Grandmaster reported that the old man simply did not complete the process completely. Next, I began to prepare the old man for acupuncture. Huan planned to unclog the ducts, which would allow the wolf's blood to function normally in Lokar. Having prepared himself, he pointed his palm towards the old man. Next, dozens of needles rushed into that one's body. A couple of hours passed after this process, and someone stopped Lokar on the street. The unknown person turned out to be a certain Liube, who was extremely interested in the mansion. Lokar said that the Grandmaster himself lived there. Lokar advised the Grandmaster, but also warned him about his unusual character. Lokar promised that the Grandmaster would solve any problems, but first he had to pay him handsomely. Having received valuable information, Liube thanked the old man. Accordingly, he looked in on the Grandmaster. The Grandmaster already knew something about the blacksmith in advance, but nevertheless wanted to hear about his problem. In response, Liube pleaded about the problem of losing his former professional acumen. Afterwards, at the Grandmaster's request, the blacksmith demonstrated the best of the weapons ever made. Taking the weapon from the blacksmith's hands, the Grandmaster began to examine it. The blacksmith humbly waited to see what conclusion the Grandmaster would draw. And after a minute, the Grandmaster actually spoke, unexpectedly calling Liube a supporter of good food. The blacksmith made a face at this information, considering that he was being insulted. Liquid was worried, because Liube had a rather violent temper. The Grandmaster was not afraid of the blacksmith, continuing to pursue his own line regarding Liube's culinary interests. In the end, the blacksmith was forced to admit the truth of the Grandmaster's words. Sighing, the Grandmaster began to explain what role food played in Liube's misfortune. The story was long, so the blacksmith did not understand what the Grandmaster was getting at. At some point, the Grandmaster ended up linking the blacksmith's problems to certain food preferences. Because of the special food, the blacksmith unintentionally reduced his own spiritual powers. Afterwards, he began to explain in detail the meaning of his words. Liube was discouraged, because in all details the Grandmaster was right. Having finished, the Grandmaster loudly placed the cup on the table. Falling to his knees, Liube promised that he would never again touch his previously favorite food. And yet the blacksmith wanted to know what he should do. For the first time, Huan was confused, because the astral library had no answers to this question. In order not to lose face, Huan took a simple approach, simply instructing Liube to no longer eat the same food. The blacksmith openly thanked the Grandmaster for the advice. Liube was happy, because the expenses he spent on visiting the Grandmaster were justified. Afterwards, deciding to ask for help in one more matter. The Grandmaster frowned when the subject of forging came up. Realizing that he had rushed into this matter, Liube cancelled the question and asked for forgiveness. Next, making a gesture with his hand, the Grandmaster asked his servant to send the blacksmith away. Politely, Liquid asked Luby to leave the mansion. At this point, the reception ended. In his chambers, Juan collapsed on his bed, exhausted. The burden of being a Grandmaster weighed heavily on him, and yet, recognizing that such personalities were extremely fascinating. Juan was convinced that the further he went along his path, the more knowledge he needed. Finding himself inside the astral library again, he noticed an unusual-looking book there. As soon as his gaze touched the book, it began to float towards his hands. Juan opened the book with interest, but no matter how many pages he turned, they all turned out to be blank. Having slammed that one shut, Juan decided to turn to other scriptures. As soon as he was distracted, the book in his hands began to move. Having opened, it flew up, starting to emit a kind of glow. Just one glance told Juan that this book was the culmination of the entire library. Then, in a split second, it sucked in all the other books, after which it closed with a loud bang. Immediately after this, like a comet, the golden book fell to the floor. Unexpectedly, the action moved to another mansion. The servants there were actively discussing their master's troubles. At this time, the owner himself created some kind of rule for the family. However, absolutely everyone received this news with sadness. Even his son had a few words on the matter. Expressing disapproval, he spoke of the Grandmaster who was in the city. The old man became interested in the news. Then his son began to talk about the great things that the Grandmaster had done. The old man wanted to hear as many details about the Grandmaster as possible. In this case, he began to talk about the Grandmaster's miraculous healings. Being extremely interested, the old man asked his son to take him to the Grandmaster. The son was not sure about this decision, since his father had previously wanted to sell the property. The old man, hobbling as quickly as possible, did not want to hear anything about such a thing. Afterwards, the action moved to the outskirts of the city. The elder living there was slightly irritated by the commotion in the city. The servant who ran up to him informed him of various events in the city. In particular, the case concerned certain star ratings. These were various events that were divided according to their degree of importance. The elder was interested in one of these events, so I wanted to hear more details about it. In this case, the servant began to talk about the Grandmaster. The elder cut the story short, for there were no records of such a Grandmaster. The servant was not so confident, for the Grandmaster had managed to prove himself. The new information about the Grandmaster impressed the elder. The servant did not stop, continuing the story. The more the elder learned about the Grandmaster, the more attention stars he awarded him. Oddly enough, the servant's story didn't stop there. Ultimately, the elder gave the Grandmaster's figure the highest rating. He even shouted at the servant because he asked his master again about this decision. A little later, Juan woke up. Due to strange events in the astral library, he completely lost consciousness. But before he could come to his senses, something unexpected happened. For some reason, a myriad of knowledge was swarming in his head. He looked around, not seeing the ill-fated golden book anywhere in the middle of the astral library. Later, Juan realized that he had spent almost the entire day in his chambers. And yet, Juan had no choice but to accept the image of the Grandmaster. On the street, Liquid was already meeting him with important news. As it turned out, the new noble lords were seeking a meeting with the Grandmaster. After Juan learned of the huge payment in advance, he invited guests inside the mansion. Very quickly, Juan resolved the issues with them and returned to his own school. Lida, who met the teacher, announced that Anga had arrived in the class. Juan did not look for a meeting with that one. Anga, on the contrary, was glad to finally see Juan. The girl admitted that she had been looking for this for a very long time. As it turned out, she brought Juan an invitation from a collector. Juan hoped that they wanted to show him the new library. Giggling shyly, Anga confessed about the trial of herself and Inai, so the girl strongly begged Juan to come to this event. Juan sighed heavily, because the matter was devoted to creativity, about which the returnee knew nothing. Be that as it may, he agreed to participate. Laughing awkwardly, Anga suggested that Juan move on immediately. Juan had no choice but to leave school again. Along the way, Anga complained that she knew absolutely nothing about what was to come. From the story, Juan learned that a certain famous physician was also present among the judges. Anga spoke well of him, describing him as a very talented writer with a brush. Juan was even somewhat envious of this man's skill. Anga ended her story by saying that only in Juan's presence could the trial of the young people be legitimate. After some time, Anga brought Juan to the right house. There, Juan apologized for keeping him waiting so long. Afterwards, Juan was led inside, where he was joyfully called out to. The collector introduced Master Omnom to the returnee. Next, he performed a similar action in the opposite direction. The collector was so generous with his praise that Juan even felt a little awkward. The collector did not stop, setting Juan as an example for all young people. Finally, he invited the young people into the room. Then he announced the rules of the competition, after which he introduced the young people to those who would evaluate their work. Unexpectedly, Juan, as a recognized master, was awarded the task of painting the picture. The returnee tried not to show that he was completely discouraged by what he heard. Having time, he decided to express his thoughts on this matter. The collector reassured Juana, believing that in this way it would be possible to instill a love of painting in young people. Juan was sweating. He didn't know how else to convey the idea that he absolutely couldn't draw. The collector probably wouldn't have heard that and would have already given orders to prepare everything. He also gave orders to young people to closely monitor the work of others. Juan trembled because he was unable to even draw a straight line with a pencil. The collector invited Omnom to create first. He bowed and then went to get the brush. Lightly, he dipped the brush into the paint. Next, I started to create sharply. With daring movements, he drew on the parchment. The collector explained to the young people that this is exactly what the highest art looked like. At some point in time, the healer finished creating. Afterwards, he began to apologize, because it was the first time he had picked up a brush after a long time. Anga couldn't keep silent and decided to ask the master a question. The collector explained about the recreated painting, but the young people had to figure out the details themselves. Subsequently, Juan was invited to the canvas. The returnee began to take difficult steps. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came into his head, and Juan asked to read it first. The collector sincerely did not understand this desire. He even thought that Juan lacked some knowledge. Juan tried to justify himself somehow. Unexpectedly, Omnom stood up to defend Juan's proposal. He saw reason in this action because Juan was very young, claiming that in such a case, Juan could refresh his memory of the skills. Remembering Juan's previous reading results, the collector gave him permission with apprehension. Having received permission, Juan quickly headed to the library. At the same time, the collector tried to justify Juan's strange behavior. Omnom also stood up for him, calling this trait inherent in future masters. After thinking, Enai named the name of a man who had exactly the same habit. Master Omnom confirmed this, even telling a story about such a man. Be that as it may, something was bothering the doctor. The collector was ready to listen. Omnom admitted that when studying the painting, he saw in Juan's eyes only a gaping void of incomprehension. The collector defended Juan by talking about the revelation of the secret of his painting. Laughing, Omnom decided to stop at the fact that he could have been wrong. While there was still time, the collector started a conversation with the healer about his future plans. Omnom admitted that he wanted to visit the Grandmaster. Moreover, he invited the collector to pay him a joint visit. The young people also whispered among themselves about this man. At the same time, some events were taking place at the educational institution. Once again, without Juan's supervision, his students fought a duel. But for now, no one was sure about the outcome of the battle. Some people bet on Zheng, and some on his opponent. Lita explained that the balance of power was most likely unequal, since the opponent was a man from an influential family. On the other hand, she mentioned a new fighting technique that the spearman had mastered. Io believed that Zhen didn't have a chance after all. Nika stood up for her classmate, because Juan himself helped him. In any case, for now, all they could do was watch. Zhen's opponent warned him not to relax. Zhen slammed his fists on the concrete floor of the arena and called for the start, after which the fight quickly started. So far, the initiative was on Zhen's side. Tom managed to actually mock his opponent. His classmates saw that Zhen was mostly bragging, and only Io laughed, understanding everything. He explained that Zhen and his opponent were childhood friends, and therefore the fight between them was not entirely serious. The fat man confirmed this after hearing Zhen warn about his techniques. As expected, the girls were impressed by such strong connections. Meanwhile, the sound of the sticks striking each other echoed throughout the arena. The beautiful duel was still going on. Like Zhen, his opponent announced his chosen fighting technique before striking. In the end, even having managed to get there, Zhen reluctantly admitted that his opponent's technique was sound. Somehow he still managed to stop after receiving the blow. Then he grouped himself and changed his position. Now, Zhen wanted to surprise his opponent by demonstrating something. Next, twisting the staff in his hands, he hit the blunt end of it on the ground. Zhen warned that the technique had not yet been fully mastered. His childhood friend was amazed, because he had never seen anything like it before. Zhen did something that changed the very atmosphere of the world. Finally, having released the spiritual dragon. For a moment, and with its mouth open, the dragon's head rushed towards its opponent. The childhood friend froze, feeling fear. His eyes trembled. Another second and a special spiritual blow hit him. In the end, he lost his balance. After finishing his blow, Zhen became frightened about the condition of his childhood friend. His classmates could hardly believe that the fighting technique taught by Juan could be so all-powerful. As quickly as possible, Zhen ran to his childhood friend, helping him stand up. When asked about what happened, he laughed, blaming teacher Juan for everything. His childhood friend was puzzled, because Juan was not famous as a spearman. In response, Jen only praised Huang. And yet, the childhood friend wanted to know at least the name of the technique. Jen thought about it for a moment, but soon admitted that the technique didn't have a name as such. It was the first time a childhood friend had encountered such an absurd story. In the end, Jen asked his childhood friend to help him figure out the name. He even laughed when the conversation turned to disrespect for his teacher. After all, Juan allowed his students to come up with names on their own. At the same time, books rustled in the collector's library. At some point, Juan found a rack where books about the art of painting were kept. Juan hoped that with their help he would be able to cope. Naturally, to resolve the situation, he used the astral library. Right now, the collector was heading to the library, because Juan had disappeared there for 3 whole hours. Now Juan was there in a state of trance. It was found in this condition by a collector. The collector began to look closely at him, and at that very moment, Juan opened his eyes. Both characters recoiled in a panicked scream. Juan tried to understand what the collector was trying to achieve. The master himself assumed a defensive posture, fearing that Juan had again moved up to the next rank. He let out a sigh of relief when Juan informed him that this had not happened. Juan even laughed at what was said, because it was simply impossible to move up to the next rank so easily. The collector's expression changed, because Juan had already pulled off something similar. Besides, the returnee was just ready for the test. Returning together, Juan apologized for keeping everyone waiting. The collector suggested that he start painting the picture immediately. With a brisk step, Juan headed towards the stand with tassels. Everyone held their breath, expecting to see something special. For the next couple of seconds, Juan juggled the brushes with a thoughtful expression on his face. Subsequently, one after another, he began to soak them in paint. For some reason, I even tasted the paint. No one present understood his actions. Having finished showing off, Juan was ready to get down to business. Following which, he launched one of the brushes into the air. Then, tossing and changing brushes as he went, Juan began to paint. The process that Juan organized was more like a show. The paint flew in all directions, but some pattern was still visible on the canvas. Only now did the collector realize that Juan used the dragon technique in his writing. Omnom explained to the young men that such technology was truly rare. Almost breathlessly, the collector commented on how exactly this technique worked. Omnom agreed with his words, calling the technique very complex, but extremely interesting. The collector concluded that even those present did not master this drawing technique. He didn't understand how Juan could even draw like that. Omnom asked everyone to calm down, because Juan could have made a mistake, and then the picture would not have been possible. Omnom reminded that hand movements should always be connected with clarity of mind. And yet, Juan continued to draw, never stopping. At some point, Inai noticed that Juan's movements had changed. The returnee took up the brushes in a different way. The collector was amazed by what he saw. After a couple of final strokes, the painting was ready. He held his breath because the picture was so delightful. Omnom supported his friend's words. Besides, Juan himself was pleased with what had been done. With his permission, everyone carefully approached the canvas. The old masters confirmed something sadly. The young people, on the contrary, were delighted with her. Omnom concluded that although the painting was beautiful, it lacked concept. The collector agreed with this, asking Juan not to be upset, since everything would come with experience. At the same time, the doctor asked Juan to be a little more modest. The returnee thought that he would probably still be scolded for being late. However, Omnom was talking about honing his skills. The collector supported him, giving him valuable advice for the future. At this point, the young people also had comments, because the creatures in Juan's painting were eyeless. Without noticing this, the collector was already ready to make a remark to Juan. But he, grabbing the brush as quickly as possible, began to make corrections. With quick movements, he added important details to the picture. After this had been done, everyone present was again overcome with the emotion of surprise. Because now, the picture literally shone because of the new details in it. Her incredible images literally lit up the room with their beauty. Barely able to speak, the collector acknowledged the 5th level of the painting, which was executed with the utmost spirituality. It so happened that Juan achieved the highest level of development in the fine arts. Everything was so magnificent that the living images even bowed to their creator. Omnom was shocked, because previously he had considered stories about such paintings to be complete fiction. Inai spoke up, almost begging Juan to sell the painting. As best he could, he began to persuade Juan to break up with her. Anga tried to bring the young man to his senses, because with his behavior he insulted Juan's artistic genius. After graduating, she herself expressed a desire to purchase the painting at any price. Later, the young people began to argue among themselves. Their argument continued for so long that the collector's patience was wearing thin. At a certain point, he shouted at those. The collector reserved the right to control the fate of the painting only to Juan himself. The young people came to their senses and began to apologize for their earlier behavior. Juan never expected that people would actually want to buy his creation. After coughing a couple of times, the collector confirmed this, and even went so far as to name a hefty price. Juan's eyes lit up when he heard about the 2 million, after which, young people gradually began to agree to this price. Overjoyed, Juan was ready to paint another picture in order to sell both. The collector was amazed by this decision, because Juan monetized his work so easily. A little later, Anga and Inai each purchased a painting. Juan himself greedily counted the money. The collector distracted him by starting a conversation about the emperor. Through the efforts of others, Juan was able to gain access to the imperial library. Juan thanked the collector, then said goodbye and left. As for the Grandmaster, the noblemen decided to visit him the very next day. Suddenly the collector started talking about Juan himself, expressing a desire to take him on as his student. After all, the returnee, in the opinion of others, showed extremely great promise. Wanting to learn as much as possible about Juan, the collector turned to Anga. Anga became worried, not knowing how best to describe everything. The girl was worried that the master might even get angry. In that case, Anga spoke about Juan's difficult reputation. Anga assumed that Juan had been slandered and was a victim. Omnom was furious at this situation. Additionally, the girl said that Juan's offenders had already been punished. The collector did not calm down, believing that he should have personally intervened in the situation. In addition, I also want to learn as much as possible. In that case, Anga told about Juan's challenge to a teacher's duel. Hearing this, Omnom explained what the duel consisted of. Anga continued her story, mentioning Juan's opponent as a very famous teacher. The collector urgently demanded that the man's name be given. Then, Anga vividly described Lu, the son of a wealthy family. After hearing this, the collector burst into an unprecedented stream of abuse. His rage boiled over. He threatened to destroy Lu physically, spiritually, and reputationally. At that moment, a servant appeared, carrying a letter with him. As it turned out, it was from the emperor himself. Carefully, the collector took over the message. Opening it and running his eyes over the words, the collector was stunned. He even handed the letter over to the doctor for review. Unexpectedly, the collector ordered that his carriage be prepared. After some time, the carriage was already approaching the gates of the noble estate. There, at the gate, the collector learned that the emperor was still not there. He was absent, and therefore the collector and the healer decided to wait. Having the opportunity for now, they talked about everything. Half an hour later, the clatter of hooves could be heard far away from the street. At one glance, the collector understood who was riding there. The procession stopped, and the emperor himself appeared from the carriage. The emperor greeted the noble people who were waiting for him. Next, the emperor asked his guests to follow him. Having done so, a surprise suddenly emerged. The great grandmasters were waiting in the audience house. However, it was not they who greeted them, but them. Then he started talking about the elder who was very ill. The emperor interrupted them, introducing the people behind him. That's where the pleasantries part ends. In that case, the emperor moved on to the essence of the general meeting. The matter concerned the healing of an elder. The grandmasters were not sure that they could help him. They all came to the same conclusion about the elder's imminent death. The emperor was disappointed, although he accepted the verdict. However, the grandmasters did not consider themselves the final authority. The emperor was about to despair, but then the doctor spoke up. Omnom decided to share the news about a new grandmaster in the city. The emperor looked at the physician with interest. He continued to talk about the amazing connoisseur. The other grandmasters were also intrigued. Omnom explained that he had only heard about it, but had not met him yet. One of the grandmasters doubted what was said. After all, the name of the city grandmaster was completely unfamiliar to him. So, the grandmasters were not averse to meeting him. The collector spoke up and promised to take everyone there. After all these conversations, a lot of time passed. A new radiant day has arrived. In a good mood, Juan dropped in to see the collector. There he was disappointed. It so happened that the collector did not take Juan with him to the library. But for now, I decided to start a conversation about stupid Lu. From the conversation, Juan realized that Lu was somehow the collector's son. Sighing, the collector spoke about a long-standing conflict with his son. Juan waved it off, making it clear that he couldn't show weakness. Later, after some persuasion, the collector finally accompanied Juan. Together, they reached the Imperial Library itself. To avoid any problems, Juan was given a special pass. Having the opportunity to read all the books, Juan thanked the collector. The collector asked to dispense with thanks and said goodbye. Afterwards, Juan went inside the library. As usual, he started reading everything there. At the same time, Omnom led everyone to the Grandmaster's mansion. Next, he turned to the servant at the gate. Just now, suddenly, the gates opened. Liquid appeared and announced the admission rules. Omnom coughed, trying to convince him that he had come to show respect. But Liquid was not at all bothered by these sweet words. He acted boldly, feeling the full support of his master. Then, one of the grandmasters who had arrived joined the conversation. He tried to resolve the dispute, but was grabbed by the beard. Sternly, Liquid once again voiced the rules of admission. The grandmaster remained calm, deciding to present the Emperor's mark. However, Liquid didn't give a damn about all this. Deciding not to delay any longer, Omnom shoved money into Liquid's hands. Having taken the money, Liquid was even indignant that it had taken so long. Afterwards, he asked to wait for an invitation from the Grandmaster. The doctor was confused when he realized what conditions he had agreed to. So, he once again tried to achieve his goal by being polite. He had no intention of telling the servant about the specifics of his visit. Liquid thought differently, boasting about his training with his master. In this case, one of the Grandmasters decided to test the servant. Unexpectedly, Liquid asked him about his family. Seeing the surprise on his face, Liquid decided to change the question slightly. Eyewitnesses were amazed by Liquid's courage, but no matter how hard the servant tried, he received no answer. After which he even wanted to touch someone else's wife. Having remembered something, he considered that the person in front of him could have been an animal. The Grandmaster could barely contain himself. He was ready to destroy the insolent man. Only thanks to the efforts of his colleagues did he not resort to murder. Only after the explanation did Liquid realize who he was arguing with. Taking advantage of the opportunity, they explained to Liquid how he should proceed next. Shaking, he began to tell that he had not seen the gentleman for a long time. With such answers, Liquid only made everyone more angry. There was nothing to do, so Liquid was handed the scroll. After what had been done, the guest decided to leave. In complete shock from what had happened, Liquid fell to his knees. The gate guards rushed to bring him back to his senses. Further events moved on to the crew. Inside the carriage, important gentlemen discussed what they had seen. They came to the conclusion that a Grandmaster lived inside the mansion. They made this conclusion based on the environment and Liquid. The Grandmasters felt that Liquid was not up to par. Exactly, they named Liquid's rank. Besides, Liquid looked like a man full of energy. The Grandmasters concluded that without outside help, this was impossible to achieve. They even had some ideas about how it happened, considering that the owner of Liquid was a strong man. Coming to a conclusion, treat Liquid's owner with caution, and yet it was unclear what to do. In this case, the Grandmasters saw no problems. After all, they could study people remotely. At the same time, Juan finished studying books. Having found what he needed, he sat down to meditate. A minute later, he discovered something incredible. It turned out that Juan had mastered all the points of his body. So, he focused on searching for new information. Juan was just a short distance away from the next rank. But first, he had to learn new fighting techniques. At the same time, I found useful information for my students. Now Juan had to compile everything. With the help of the Astral Library, he created new scriptures. Excited, he decided to study one of the recreated books.